We have some fabulous material for you all today. If you haven't already, please make sure to grab yourself some lunch, late lunch. And Seth, let's have you come up and introduce yourselves. We'd love for you to meet our sponsors for your lunch that you're enjoying before we get started.
Hey, how's it going, guys? Good. Hey, my name is Seth, and this is Jake, and we're with Elite Contract Services. Tried to provide enough lunch to you. I think that we brought too much, so please go back for seconds or thirds if you guys need. Okay, so Jax is going to kind of go through this. Jax is our good friend. And what he'll kind of tell you guys is when you set up a seller finance deal, it's always good to have an escrow company in between the buyer and the seller to make sure that everything stays on the up and up, right? That's what we do. So we facilitate seller finance mortgages, and we do it all day, every day. We probably have about 500 counts and growing. So the other things that we do is any kind of creative escrow work that you guys can think of, or if your buyers have like water rights that need to be held in escrow or anything like that, that's something that we can take care of. Yeah, you have anything that you want to say, Jake?
Hiring our company is a way of safety between the buyer and the seller. That's one thing that we just strive to do, is to make sure that everyone is safe and that the contract is being handled properly. No matter what, we always just make sure that everyone is taken care of, and we try to do that in the best way possible.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any other questions for us quick, or we just want to let you get going? Okay. Sounds good. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So again, welcome to Keller Williams Salt Lake City. My name is Linda Birch. I'm the team leader here. If you all have any questions after the course material about where to learn more or what else we're doing here that's crazy cool, like seller finance, CE, myself and then my partner Nate Sassy here, we would be happy to answer any of your questions afterwards. And without further ado, Jax, would you like to get started?
I'm very excited to be here. I love teaching this class, and I actually have some new information for you. So whenever I get a lot of questions that to me seem obvious but aren't, I like to put that into the material. So I'm going to start by introducing a couple of other presenters. We've got myself, George Andersen, and Dave Kenny. The reason they're here is because they have expertise that I don't. I cover the legal side. I cover your and my assets, is how I like to say it, when it comes to doing transactions so that there aren't hiccups, issues with licensing or liability. But I bring George in because he is a mortgage banker, and that may sound strange in a seller finance class. But by the end of this class, you'll understand how critical it is to have somebody, because you don't want to put your buyers into a seller financing transaction for 2 years when they need 5. You don't want to create transactions that are destined to fail. So he'll go through the lending side. Excellent. And then we also have David Kenny. David Kenny is one of you, the most amazing group ever, the Realtors. And I'm not a Realtor, so I don't do the transactional side and the initial dealing with the clients. But he's going to share some incredibly valuable information for you as agents and or brokers. And then I'll be taking the last half of the class. Now, what usually happens is at the beginning of the class, nobody puts this in their phone. At the end of the class, everyone's frantically putting it in their phone. So when you do that, I would suggest, in fact, I met somebody just before class that had put this in their phone, and I think it's magical because it means you will have a seller finance deal. And she came up to me and said, hey, I've got a buyer. They want to buy in Saratoga Springs. Do you have anything? And I said, why, yes, I do. 2-year-old house in Saratoga Springs that's not even on the market yet, that's going to be seller financing available. So I would, again, put these in and maybe put in, what she did is she put Jax Seller Financing Pettey, so that when she completely forgot my name, which is understandable. I would too. But she had a question on seller financing. She could just look up seller financing. But before I get any farther, which will be my start of the presentation, I'm going to turn the time over to Dave. And can we give him a round of applause? He's doing this for free to help and teach you, and we appreciate him.
Normally I don't need a microphone, but since I've got one stuffed in my hand, I guess I'll have to use it. Every time I get a microphone, I feel like I should be singing instead of teaching, but I won't do that. I won't do that. All right, so we're going to talk about seller financing today, and it is not a boring subject. So everybody knows that there are different markets, and those of us who've been around for a long time have seen them all. We've seen seller markets, and we've seen buyers markets, and today we're in a very unique market. There are thousands of people out there with really low interest rates on their mortgages. And we call these people stuck in a golden handcuff because they don't want to sell their house to lose their mortgage. And so they're going, I really would need to move up. I've got 2 more kids in the house and we need a few more bedrooms, whatever. And normally there'd be a lot of people moving from house to house in our industry. But today they think twice about it, because they don't want to have that mortgage paid off and then go get a 6.5% to 7% mortgage on their new house. I totally get it. So when I sit down with a listing presentation, I start out by asking people, hey, bring me your mortgage. And they go, Dave, I want to sell my house. What does that have to do with anything? Well, let me explain it. How would you like to be able to keep your mortgage? Well, I would love to be able to do that, but I'm selling my house. Okay, but how would you like to keep your mortgage and transfer the benefit to your new house? You go, wait a minute here. I know your name's Dave, but I didn't think it was David Copperfield. What kind of magic are you coming up with? You can't transfer your mortgage to your new house. I go, no, that's true. But through the techniques of seller financing, you can get a buyer to buy your house where you're the bank. You can keep your mortgage, and the buyer will pay you a higher interest rate than what your current mortgage is. So you're making money on the bank's money. And by doing that, you get cash flow on your old house, which can transfer over to help you make your new payment, even though it's at a higher rate. And I'll explain that in a lot more detail in a minute. Seller goes, wow, that is terrific. The other thing that's happened, and I know you've all seen this, you go and you see a listing, it's been on the market for 30 days. Almost every single listing I see, list price, new price, and what's happened? Sellers are dropping their prices. And your sellers are going, oh man, Dave, I wish I would have done this 2 years ago. When everybody, as soon as you list your house, you were getting multiple offers, above asking price offers. And now that's just not happening. And people think they've lost the opportunity to get a better price for their house. I said, well, I can get you a better price for your house as a seller. Well, how do you do that? Well, let me think here. If you have a really nice home and you're willing to be the bank, you're offering 2 things. You're offering the house and you're offering financing. So if I'm a buyer who can't qualify for a mortgage for whatever reason, and there's lots of different reasons why people can't qualify, not just because they're, terrible people, but there's lots of different reasons why good people can't get a mortgage right now. Or maybe they just don't like the interest rates, and a seller's willing to offer a lower than current market rate. So if the seller is willing to do seller financing, then they're selling 2 things, the house and the financing. So if I'm an agent representing a buyer who can't qualify for a mortgage and probably won't be able to qualify for 2 to 3, 4, or 5 years, would I be willing to pay a little extra for the house? Of course I would. And so I'm sitting there, okay, well, here I've got a listing. It normally would sell for $575,000. I can generally get about 10% more for the house. And the seller's going, wait a minute, I've been told that all sorts of people list their homes and they're having to take less for their house. And you're telling me I can get more for my house than appraised value? Yeah, that's what I'm telling you. And not only can you get more, but because you've lived in the house 2 out of the last 5 years, that extra money you're getting here for your house is 100% tax-free. I'm liking this. Now, Dave, you're being honest with me. You're not just trying to bid up the listing so you can get the listing, right? I said, no, absolutely. So I just had a house go under contract today. The appraised value was $500,000. It went under contract for $550,000. The contract is for 30 years, no balloon. Interest rate, 6% for somebody who can't qualify for a loan. Well, that's dishonest. What do you mean it's dishonest? Well, you're selling this poor buyer a house for a lot more money than it's worth. I said, I didn't see anybody complaining about that 2 years ago when everybody was bidding house prices up and saying, look, even if it doesn't appraise for that, I'll pay the difference. Well, that was dishonest. No, it wasn't. It's called the market. So what is a house worth? What a willing buyer and a willing seller agree that it's worth. Unless you're getting a mortgage. And then it's a willing buyer and a willing seller and a willing appraiser. Then that's what the house is worth. So it's under contract. 3 things that looked at that. Number 1, it was a beautiful home. So it was a great asset. Number 2, they were willing to do seller financing. And number 3, they were willing to do a 30-year contract. That was a very valuable asset. And it went in 5 days from the time it listed. Okay? Now, in addition, they look at that and say, well, most seller financing contracts, you're not necessarily going to get the seller to be able to do a full 30 years. I say that might be true. And so typically we look at seller financing when we're talking to the seller as kind of a bridge loan. Here I've got a buyer that wants to buy your house. If you will be the bank, then this buyer will refinance that within whatever the term, 3 to 5 years is a typical term. Why 3 years? Well, maybe it's because the buyer wants to be able to give a chance for interest rates to come down. And they believe that in the next 3 years, interest rates would probably come down. And that might be a good bet. It might be they need that much time because they've sat down with the lender and they need to get a few things taken care of in their qualifying to be able to qualify for a mortgage. So the seller says, okay, I would be willing to do that. If I can get a little better price for my house, I get it sold, and this is sounding really good. So typically seller financing is a short term, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. I've had sellers who look at the kind of return they're making on their equity, and it many times is 15, 18%. And they're going, dang, would this buyer like to have a 30-year contract? Where can I get 18% return on my money? Yes.
How are you telling them to sell?
Oh, that's an excellent question. It always comes up, and I love it. So I've bought a lot of homes over my career with seller financing. One time I bought a house that had a loan with Chase. And by the way, how many mortgages have a due on sale clause? They all do. Okay, let's get that out of the way. They all have a due on sale clause. So if I have a mortgage that has a due on sale clause, can I sell my house? Yeah, it's totally legal to sell my house. I have the right to sell my house. The due on sale clause says that the bank may call the loan due and payable. It doesn't say they have to, okay? So we'll take that into account. How does the bank actually exercise their due on sale? So I had this house I bought. I've been paying the bank directly. I didn't go through an escrow company. This was about 20 years ago. I was paying Chase directly. So they knew that I was not their borrower. And one day I got a letter from Chase saying, this loan is in default. And I thought, oh my gosh, they're actually going to call the loan due and payable. So I took that letter and I immediately walked over and I threw it away. Bink. And I made the next payment. And lo and behold, the bank sent me another letter saying, never mind, it's just fine. And this is the reason why. It's very painful for a bank to call the loan due and payable. They have to take a performing loan and walk it over to their foreclosure department. And now they have an additional foreclosure in their assets. And if they get too many of those, the feds can come in and tell them that they're insolvent. So they don't like to have a lot of foreclosures. So when I sent another payment and they cashed it, that's a problem for them. Because if they actually start the foreclosure, they have to foreclose. If they start the foreclosure, they can no longer accept any more payments. Okay? Now, having said that, we cannot assert or, tell people that they don't have to worry about the due on sale clause. Okay? Because it's very real. I'm just telling you that my experience over the last 40 years is I've never seen a bank actually call the loan due and payable. So, very good question. What about the due on sale clause? There is a paragraph in the seller financing addendum that discloses there is a due on sale clause. If the bank chooses to call the loan due and payable, the responsibility for paying that bank off belongs to the buyer. So they either have to refinance or pay it off or sell the house. Okay? Any other questions on that? Excellent question. Okay, so the other thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about how do the banks look at these things. So I just got my buyer into a contract for deed or a seller financing contract. Those contracts that they have, how does a bank look at those contracts when it comes time for them to refinance? Are they going to look at it and say, oh, this is a good contract. We can refinance this contract. Or are they going to say, wait a minute, you're not on title. We can't refinance this. So we'll have to treat it as a purchase. I don't want it to be treated as a purchase. The house has gone up in value. I want you to use the current appraised value to determine my loan to value ratio. If it's low enough, I can avoid mortgage insurance. There's a whole different set of underwriting guidelines for a refinance versus a purchase. I don't want you to have to go back to the time I bought it and source my down payment. And George is going to talk a little bit more about this when we get George up here. I want to refinance it. And so it's important that the documents we get our buyers in are documents that an underwriter can look at and say, it's right there in my guidelines. I can treat this as a refinance, not a purchase. Okay? Now, from the seller's point of view, my sellers are just thrilled. Oh, Dave, you got me more money for my house. I'm making money on the bank's money. This is just absolutely fantastic. You sold my house, but now I'm homeless. How do I qualify for my next house? Well, that's a very important question. Not everybody can qualify for 2 mortgages because I didn't pay off their mortgage. So that old mortgage is still on their credit report. So when an underwriter looks at their credit report and is determining their debt to income ratios, that could be a problem unless I structure it properly. So an underwriter will look at those documents and say, oh, this is a lease. I can take 75% of that income and offset your current mortgage. I don't have to put it in your debt at all. I just act like it's not even there. Okay? So both things are very important. So it's important for a lender to sit down with the seller as well so that they can tell them how a seller financing contract would affect them in being able to get their next mortgage. And finally, it's important that we do things legally. Now, back in 1980, when I got into real estate, most of you weren't even born then, interest rates were 18%. We did not take our buyers down to the local mortgage company to get them pre-qualified. Nobody got mortgages in 1980. Everything we did was seller financing. And we didn't have the really cool addendums that we have now. And so we would pull out a blank addendum sheet and start writing. What were we doing? We're practicing law, okay? So we don't want to do that. And so it's very important we know how to do these kind of contracts legally, which forms we use, what kind of liberty we have to make sure the terms that we've agreed to are included in legal contracts. We want to close at a title company that will produce final contracts that are protecting the buyer and the seller, are disclosing the risks of seller financing, and are contracts that are prepared by attorneys. So we definitely want to see how the law looks at this. Now, I can't tell you how many times I've dealt with other realtors and I say, look, I'd like to present a seller financing contract. Oh, you can't do seller financing. Those are illegal. No, they're not illegal. If they were illegal, why do we have a seller financing addendum on the MLS? Why do we have a core class for CE that's approved by the Division of Real Estate if what we were teaching is illegal? It's not illegal. It just needs to be done properly, okay? And so a good section of this CE class will be talking about the legality of seller financing. All right, let's just jump right in now. I'm going to talk about 3 types of seller financing. There's actually a few more, but these are the main ones that we're going to come across. Lease option. We all love to do lease options. We take our buyer down to the lender, and the lender says, these people cannot qualify. Well, most vanilla real estate agents are going, oh, I'm sorry, I can't sell you a house because you don't qualify for a mortgage. What do you mean I don't qualify? I've got $70,000 I can put down. I'm self-employed. I've got a good, wait a minute. That's the problem. Anybody here know somebody who's self-employed? These mortgage people, they don't like us for some reason. But I've got $70,000 I can put down. Well, I guess you'll just have to lease with an option to purchase. And this is the kind of the go-to seller financing option we all are familiar with. And I don't know about you, how many of you love to do lease options? I don't see any hands. Why not? I never get paid. Well, okay, let me tell you something. It is possible for you to require the seller to pay you up front. So it doesn't have to be paid at the end when the buyer actually exercises their option. But the only way a seller is going to do that is if the buyer has a substantial down payment, okay? So if I get a buyer and they come in and say, I'd love to buy a house, Dave. So, okay, great. What kind of a down payment do you have? Well, I have $2,500. Okay, how's your credit? Well, it kind of stinks. How's your income? Well, I'm in between jobs. You need to live with your mom, sorry. I'm not going to waste my time driving you all over the valley looking for a house for you, okay? But I am going to tell you one thing that's really cool about a lease option. So somebody comes to me and they go, Dave, I got into a lease option 5 years ago. I have the right to buy this house for $350,000. I put $15,000 down as my option. My option expires in 2 months. I went to a lender and they told me I still don't qualify. What can I do? Most of us would like, how much did you put down? $15,000. And your option expires in 2 months? What's going to happen to their option money? That would be tragic. Well, I think that landlord should extend the contract, don't you? That would be the right thing to do. And the landlord's going, wait a minute. Dave, I'm an honest person, but contracts have consequences. Their contract expires in 2 months. This house is now worth $500,000. I am very sorry they don't qualify for a mortgage. But if they can't pay me off, I get to keep their $15,000 and they're just going to have to go somewhere else. Isn't that the way it's going to happen? And I said, hold on. They have an option. Options can be sold. I didn't know that. The option portion can be sold to somebody else. The lease portion cannot be. But I can buy lease options all the time. So somebody comes to me and says, Dave, I've got a lease option, expires in 2 months. Can you help me? I said, yeah, I'll pay off the landlord and I will take your house and renegotiate a new seller financing contract. Or I will give you your $15,000 back and I'll give you $30,000 cash when you leave. You don't have to just walk away from this thing. All of us should know that a buyer who's in a lease option where the property value has gone up, they're sitting on an asset that can be sold. Okay? Now, I don't have a lot of time to get into the particulars about that, but if you're interested in that, give me a call. Okay? So that can be a very powerful tool. So I'm not going to, badmouth lease options. Very, very powerful tool. The second type of contract is called a contract for deed. This is where the buyer enters into a contract with the seller to buy the house. The seller stays on title until the contract is paid in full. Thus the name contract for deed. So when does the buyer get title to the property? After they pay off the contract. One way to understand this is if I go buy a car and the bank gives me a loan, who keeps the title? The bank does. Well, this is a similar idea. This type of a contract has been around forever. It's not something new. Jax Pettey did not think this up all by himself. He's a smart guy, but he didn't think this one up. In 1962, when my parents sold their home in Cedar City, they sold it on a contract for deed to the new buyer. And no, I wasn't their agent. But it's been around forever. And so this type of contract is available in every single state in the country. And it's recognized as a valid type of sale by FHA, VA, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac. If you go to them and say, I've got a contract for deed, I want to refinance this, they look in the guidelines and lo and behold, it says you can refinance this as the borrower, even though you're not on title. Well, that's important to know, isn't it? Okay. Well, in the state of Utah, we don't call it a contract for deed. We like to be different. We call it a uniform real estate contract. We're the only state in the country that calls it a uniform real estate contract. Well, if I look in the guidelines for a uniform real estate contract, I won't find it. And there are some underwriters that will look at that and say, well, I'm a little bit sheepish about doing this because I don't know whether the secondary market will buy it, because it doesn't specifically say uniform real estate contract in the underwriting guidelines. And I'm going, but it does say, or other similar documents. It's an other similar document. I say, well, I don't know. I just don't feel good about it. So we're not going to do this one. And I'm going, oh my gosh. What do you mean you don't feel good about it? What did you do? Go in the back room and pray about it? It says it right there in the guidelines. It can be refinanced. Well, we're not going to do it. Do they have the right to say no? Yeah, they do. Okay. So it's important to be able to go to lenders who've done it before, and they know that they get sold to the secondary market. It's perfectly legal. It's done all the time. Okay, so that's what a contract for deed is. Okay. The next thing we want to look at is an all-inclusive trust deed. Now, on the seller financing addendum, there is a place where you indicate what does the credit document be. And there's a box to click right next to all-inclusive trust deed and note. There isn't a box to click on contract for deed, but there's a box called other. So I'm going to check other and I'm going to write in contract for deed. But because there's a specific box for all-inclusive trust deed and note, most of us think that that's the type of seller financing contract we should do. Not necessarily, okay? But an all-inclusive trust deed is where the seller passes title to the buyer with a warranty deed. And then the warranty deed you put in the warranty that it's subject to the underlying mortgage because that isn't being paid off. And the seller secures their interest in the house for the remainder equity with a trust deed, just like a bank does. And that's how that type of contract is done. And Jax will talk about the different default remedies for each type of contract. Okay, I'm not going to get into that. So with an all-inclusive trust deed, who's on title? The buyer's on title. Okay, now you got your 3 types of seller financing contracts. Any questions so far? Yes?
So if the seller is moving on and buying something, is their down payment liquid?
Yes, and it can be count.
And not tied to this home?
That
They're not going to get a big, like most.
they will get a big chunk, and that can be used to qualify for the from the buyer. So typically the buyer comes in with a large down payment.
Okay, but you had also mentioned that if the buyer doesn't have a large down payment.
Then they live with their mom.
Okay.
I hate to be so cruel, but
Are you looking for that down payment to be 20?
typically at least 10%.
Okay.
And the reason I tell people that is because out of that down payment, who's going to get paid? The realtors are going to get paid. That's 6%. Well, not anymore, because you people are so dishonest. You do. Oh, that's terrible. No, the commissions are going to get paid out of that. Closing costs for the title insurance, and so the seller would kind of like to have something after everything's done, and they don't want to bring money to the table in order to close it. Okay. Any other questions? Good question. Yeah.
When they secure their interest in the house with the all-inclusive trust deed, do they release that once it's paid in full?
Yes.
So would that need to
Just
be
like a
requested?
bank would, they have to do a reconveyance.
So the reconveyance would be requested upon full payment, right?
Yes.
Have you ever seen or done situations where the reconveyance is signed because the seller is old and may pass, and then it's held in trust somewhere, or
It's actually a very good idea. Anytime you're doing an all-inclusive, to put in your REPC that the seller will execute a request for reconveyance that's held by the title company. That whether they pass away, whether they get ornery, whatever the situation is, once the payment in full under the trust deed and note has taken place, the title company is authorized to release it via the reconveyance.
Okay, so there are a number of safeguards that Jax will get into concerning different types of contracts and how to protect the buyer and the seller. Okay, any other questions? All right, we're moving right along. So today, we're just going to cover the tip of the iceberg. Seller financing can be an incredibly exciting tool in your toolbox. Work with investors. How many houses can an investor buy with conventional loans? 10. But I want to buy 100. Sorry. Seller financing. How many houses can I buy with seller financing? As many as I want to. 1031 exchanges. I can use seller financing to do a 1031 exchange. Typically, when I'm the person that's exchanging, I'm the buyer, and I need another house to complete my exchange, that's when it works, okay? Flips. Who in the world would want to use hard money when they could use a seller financing contract from the seller? Why would I pay those nice people the type of money that they require to be able to do a flip when I could use seller financing? And I can go on and on and on about all the various tools that are, or the situations that a seller financing contract is excellent for, okay? So there's a whole bunch that we're not going to cover today. And because of that, we want to help. So I've created a whole bunch of classes on seller finance. I'm going to give you the first 2 free. On that sheet that I handed out, there is my email address. If you will email me and request those classes, I will send them to you. No charge, okay? In addition, I'm going to send you this spreadsheet as well. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But there are lots of very good training if you really want to get into the details of how to do seller finance. Or there's the experts you can call. You can call Jax. You can call George. And they'll help you with seller financing stuff. Okay. So now I'd like George to come up and talk about the role of the lender. George has been in the mortgage business for 35 years. He's had hundreds of these type of contracts go through his shop. And his underwriters know how to refinance these. He's worked with a lot of sellers and making sure that the contract that they're going to get into is acceptable for underwriters so they can get another mortgage on their new house. So it's very critical that we use lenders in this process. So come on up, George.
Okay. I'm just curious, how many people are getting this information for the first time? How many hands? Okay, all right, excellent. So how many people you're getting it for the second or third time and didn't quite absorb all of it the first time? Okay, so mine goes up there too, despite there's always something going on in this type of arena here. And the reason that I'm up here for is because I like to summarize what Dave and Jax and myself, what we have as our roles. Obviously, Jax makes sure that the legal aspect of everything is covered. Dave, I like to say, is taking care of the ethics of it. I didn't sponsor the class. I didn't bring food. I didn't bring donuts. What am I bringing to the table? Okay, so making sure that the transaction is successful. Okay, so what does success look like? If a buyer buys a home and they say that, they go to their friends and they say, I bought a house. I got seller finance. And like this person that just bought Dave's listing, they got 30-year fixed rate at 6%? 6%. Okay, did they put down 20%?
They put 50,000 down.
Was that 20%?
No, it's 10.
10%. Did they have mortgage insurance?
No mortgage insurance.
What were their closing costs, Dave?
$500.
Any lenders offering 10% down, 6%, no mortgage insurance, and $600 closing cost? Do you think the buyer cared that they're paying a little bit more money, even though they can't qualify? They got a better deal than somebody who can qualify, right? I mean, we're back up knocking at 7% again, okay? So they go to their friends and say, we just got this great deal. We just bought this house and we bought it seller finance. For that deal to be successful for them, what's the definition of a successful transaction for the buyer? Just, they're in a house, okay? They bought a house and they own a house, okay? Now, if that contract says that it's a 30-year contract and there's no prepayment penalty, does that mean, just like a mortgage, if they paid off the mortgage, then what do they get? At the end of the contract, what do they get? Contract for deed, right? So they have a contract, and if they pay it off early, when they're done, they get the deed, okay? If they want to sell the house, if the house goes up in value, if somebody owns a house the traditional way, if the house goes up in value, who gets the benefit of the increase in equity? The buyer. The buyer gets it, okay? Because they bought the house. If that house goes up in value and they decide they want to sell it, if Dave's client, 3 years from now, that house is worth $700,000 and they sell it and they've been current on their payments, Dave's equity is the difference between what he owed and what the borrower owed him. Everything above that goes to the buyer, okay? Because that's what happens when you buy a house. The bank doesn't participate in your profit on a house, do they? Okay, so when you're a seller and you sell on seller finance, you're basically becoming a bank. So the guidelines on this have changed. For the buyers, there was a little change that happened in 2013, and there's been a couple things, but every time there's been a change in the guidelines, we've had to update something in the class. And This class, the three of us have been teaching this. This is the 15th year, Jax. Do you realize that? You must be getting old. I know I am. Yeah. Jax doesn't age. Anybody ever notice that? Josh? Yeah. Right. Ryan? Yeah. Anyway, but so for the buyer, there has to be a recorded notice of interest. Now, there was just another change to the underwriting guidelines last month, okay? And I'm not going to get into the details of that, but I need to update the slides. So I got to sit down with Jax, and we got to update a couple things on here. But the idea is that if there's a recorded notice of interest, it allows the buyer to treat their transaction down the road as a refinance. They can use the appraised value. The benefit of that is that as a refinance, they don't have to document where they got their down payment from. Not every seller finance buyer has 60 days sourced and seasoned funds, do they? They don't, okay? You could use the appraised value. Maybe they put down 10% when the house was $550, but now that it's worth $700,000 and they only owe $500 on it, the loan to value is lower, so now they can refinance, not have mortgage insurance, and if their credit's good and everything else is good, they might not need an appraisal. They might only need to use 1 year of tax returns, because the lower that loan to value is, it gives some benefits to how the transaction can be structured. If the notice of interest was not recorded, they're going to lose that benefit. And there's actually an exception to that. That's one of the changes in the guidelines, Jax. But anyway, so that's what it looks like for a buyer. So how about for a seller? What would a successful transaction look like for a seller? Now, Dave is excited because he's got, well, Dave's not going to, in this market, Dave or Jax, probably not too many people who know how to do this stuff are going to be buying a home and getting a mortgage for it in this market, because there's so many sellers out there that have got a better rate, right? That would be the high value target. But if somebody's selling their home on seller finance, what does a successful transaction look like for them? They've got their cash flow. They got a little bit better sales price, so they've got cash. They may not have gotten all their equity out of the home, but they're leveraging their equity in the home and getting a great rate of return. And Dave will show the numbers on his spreadsheet that, you know, very easy to get into the teens, sometimes way more than that. There's some tax benefits for the seller and the buyer both, okay? How about if the seller sells his home and now he wants to buy another home? When he goes into the mortgage company and he says, oh, I sold my home. Well, normally they would bring into the lender, they'd bring in their HUD-1 settlement statement, right? And on the settlement statement, it shows that the mortgage, what happened to the mortgage on the HUD? Got paid off. Okay, on a seller finance transaction, that didn't happen. Okay, so the underwriter has to go, oh, well, I see your mortgage didn't get paid off. What type of transaction did you do? So one of the changes, there were some changes made in 2018 that tightened it up a little bit, and we modified how we do some of the contracts, but then there were some additional changes that were codified and kind of tightened up a couple of loopholes on some of these seller finance transactions in 2022 again. And again, just like what Dave was referencing about the underwriting guidelines, it doesn't say in the underwriting guidelines, okay, if you're dealing with somebody who sold their house on a contract for deed, you know, call the Fannie Mae 911 number and report them so that the due on sale clause can be initiated. It doesn't say that. It just says that if somebody has sold their house under fill in the blank for what type of contract, the underwriting guidelines say, this is how you deal with it. So the important thing to understand here is that there is a big difference between using income from a seller finance transaction to offset a mortgage payment and counting it as income. Now, I don't want to get into the math on this. This is one of the two videos that Dave sends out is 1 hour of me going through the guidelines, and it's really boring. It really is.
It's exciting.
No, it's really boring. Let me tell you that, no, watching that is really boring. Let me tell you where the excitement comes. The excitement comes is when your seller has sold their home on seller finance, they go into the bank and the bank says, guess what? I can't count any of that income. You are now stuck qualifying for 2 mortgage payments. That's when it gets exciting. And you don't want to have your seller be getting excited because the transaction's not working like they thought it. Some people can qualify for 2 payments. Okay, in this market, probably fewer people than what could before. So you need to understand how the contract is needs to be structured so that the underwriter can look at it and say, aha, my guidelines say that this type of contract gets treated this way. And so what we've done is, this was back in 2018 when they made the first change. I went back to Jax and I said, look, we've got a problem, because they used to be able to treat a contract for deed or an all-inclusive trust deed. Once there was 12 payments on it, it was considered a sold property. It was just like the underwriter literally took a little X-Acto knife and cut the mortgage out of the trade line and said, this just doesn't exist anymore because I've got 12 months of payment, somebody else making it. Doesn't even matter how big or small the payment was. If somebody else was making it, it's considered a sold property. Well, then they said, okay, well, now we're going to treat it more like contract income. Like if somebody had an annuity, somebody's receiving child support or money from a settlement. They said, okay, well, now we need a 12-month history to show that it's been being paid on time. But we also need to see that the contract lasts for at least 3 more years. Somebody had that right on their mouth. What else? Like now in the mortgage business, we run into this all the time with child support, right? Somebody will sit there and they've got a court-ordered court decree, court-signed divorce decree, or a child support order, and it says, okay, so-and-so gets $1,000 a month of child support. And the lender, if they know what they're doing, they're going to ask, how old is the child? Why does that matter? Because if the kid, okay, if the child support's not going to continue for at least 3 more years, can't count it. The child support could be $5,000 a month. And normally the divorce decree will have the birth date of the child in there, and you've got to have that. And you normally ask for either the birth certificate or the divorce decree. But we can't count the income if it doesn't last for at least 3 more years. So we have to have, typically, sometimes you can get by with just, it depends on how clean the loan is. You can get by with 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months, depending on how strong the buyer is. But you still got to have that 3 years remaining on it. So now we've got the same thing with contract for deed and all-inclusive trust deed. So I'm not going to get into how you calculate the income, but it is a different calculation on the debt-to-income ratios when you say that, okay, we're going to count the income from the contract, but we're also going to count the debt, okay? It messes up their debt ratios. I'm just going to leave it at that and not spend too much time with it. Let's go to the next one here. I always hate putting this one up because every time the rates change, you're just going to go, George, you're showing 7.25% on your interest rates. You know, well, depends on what time of the year you're talking about. I mean, back in November and October, this was a good rate, right? Okay, so, but anyway, the idea here is that this is the cost of money. And like what Dave was mentioning is that could a seller, I mean, if a buyer's looking at buying a home right now, okay, somebody who's like putting together like a 5% down payment, they make enough money, they can qualify for $500,000, $600,000. I mean, they're ready to get going. I mean, where is their big first, like just, you know, when they sit down and figure out how much the payment's going to be, right? Are the buyers more concerned about the purchase price of the home or what their payment's going to be right now? Okay, so if a seller has an interest rate that's like, say, below 4%, which, by the way, Fannie Mae says that 40% of all of the loans that Fannie Mae is servicing right now, 40% of all mortgages out there right now are below 4%. That's a lot of people, okay? Could a seller offer 30-year fixed rate financing at 5? Yeah, and would they make money doing it? Would a buyer be willing to pay more money for the house to have their payment be $5, $6, $8, $1,000 a month less? Yeah, okay, and to not pay closing costs too. So this is just kind of showing the cost here. Let me see, there it is. This is just kind of showing the cost. No, I don't have my little red dot. I'm okay, I'll use my finger. But anyway, so, but this is just showing the cost. This is on about a $600,000 loan. This is what a buyer would have to pay out of pocket to permanently buy their rate down to that. What do they have to pay to buy down the rate if they're using the seller's mortgage? Yeah, so this is a great deal. So this is a great way to be able to contact sellers and to evaluate their mortgage statement, figure out, well, what type of loan do you have? And then Jax will talk about, and Dave will both talk about what type of loans. You got to be very careful on how you structure the transaction. But a seller right now who has an interest rate below 4%, of which there's a lot of them, okay, they could potentially put their home back on the market with an agent who understands this. Maybe they had their listing expire 6 months ago, a year ago, or something like that, and said, hey, if I could show you how to get that original list price that you had, and then by the time you had your second or third price reduction, you just said, nope, I'm not going to sell it if that's what I got to do. There are, how many buyers out there, Dave, Jax, come into the office and have over $100,000 down seller finance? There's a lot. Yeah. Anyway, so it's amazing. And these people are, a lot of them are buying it. They're not investors. A lot of these are buying the home because they want to live in it. Okay, what are the chances that somebody's going to default on a loan that they put 10%, 15, or 20% down on, that they're going to put their family's roof over their head and have a place to live, that they can do that? What are their chances of defaulting on that? It's pretty low. It's pretty low, because that's the seller's insurance policy, is the down payment on it. So, okay, so let's go. All right, I'm just going to finish up with this. So this is you guys can look at the MLS number on this if you like. But I've got my oldest son, bought a house in 2018, did a little bit of remodeling on it, sold it in December of 2021. Pretty good timing, right? December of 21. Anyway, he doubled it. The price of the home, he sold it for more than double what he paid for it. So, I mean, and I've got 5 sons, and this kid, I mean, he's really lucky with money. And so I try to follow him around. If he ever decides to gamble or something like that, or go to the lottery, I'm going to shove money in his pocket and say, no, just go ahead, you bet, whatever. But so he came back from Florida, and him and his wife moved to Florida for a while. They came back and decided, we didn't want to live in Florida. They wanted to live here. And they came back, and the interest rates were already starting to go up. And I just told him, I said, well, Jason, I said, you've got enough money to put down. Find a potential seller that would do seller finance. Now, back then, a little over a year ago, I had a pretty crappy, but it was an okay method to try to maybe help them identify homes that were on the MLS that would potentially be seller finance. I've refined that process a little bit better, and I'd be happy to share that with anybody if they want to talk to me after the class. But so he went out and started writing offers, and he just wrote offers and say, okay, I'll give you full price, I'll put down 10%, and I'll pay you this interest rate. And on the first 6 offers that he did that with, guess what the sellers or the listing agent said on all six of those? Dracula. You know, I mean, it was, and Dad, I just give up. We'll just apply for a loan. I said, all right, fine, quit, whatever. And then he found this townhome in Spanish Fork. They put an offer on the house, and the listing agent called him and said, hey, I'm a little bit familiar with this. I'd like to ask you some questions about your offer. And he said, hold on, let me get my dad on the phone. And anyway, we got on the phone and started talking a little bit. And the reason that the seller hadn't reduced the sales price is because they had a second mortgage. And at the price that they were at, they would have had to reduce their price. They would have had to come to closing with some cash, which they did not want to do. So the offer was written, he'll pay full price, put down 10%, contract for deed, and I'll pay a 4% interest rate on the loan. By the time we worked out the details, the counter offer came back, and the seller said, come up with an extra, I think it was $10,000 or $12,000, so it was about 15% down. Come up with a little bit more money, wipe out the second, and we'll let you take over the seller's payment on their rate just as it is. Exactly, we'll let you mirror it. The underlying mortgage rate on that house, 2 3/4. So my son is sitting in a townhome in Spanish Fork right now that he bought at the same time that other people did, that put the same amount of money down that he did, and his payment's over $600 a month less. And he paid no closing costs, okay, as a buyer. And because we put down there that we'll close at First Liberty Title, and the guy said, and he goes, no, we got our own title company. Well, okay, that's fine. His title company insisted, no, we have to do an all-inclusive trust deed. And my son was like, and I was like, just take it, just go ahead. So anyway, we'll get into that a little bit later. But these deals are out there, and if you have a buyer that's got at least 10% down, in my opinion, your first option with them should maybe to see if they can, especially if they're really jumpy about the payment, which people are. I think they'd be less picky about the house if they could get a payment that is substantially below market value. So there's opportunities out there in the market right now. So anyway, any questions? Go ahead.
Who services the payments? Is it like a lease payment to the seller?
Seth and Jake, are they still here? Okay. Okay, so I've got a handful of contracts with Elite Contract. They do a fantastic job. They take care of all of the accounting, the year-end 1099s, 1098s, collecting payments, collecting late fees, payoff requests, all of that stuff. So our sponsor today is one of the escrow companies that will service that account. They will service the account, correct?
$100 to set it up, $30
Yeah.
a month.
Yeah, $30. And then you can decide how to split that. You can split it. The buyer and the seller can each pay half of it. The seller can pay, the buyer can pay. That's actually in the seller finance addendum, and that you can determine who pays what and how it breaks down. But yeah, that's a good idea, because if ever there's a dispute about, anyway, we can get into that some other time, but it's nice as a mortgage lender, if we're trying to do the loan and we have to verify the payment history, we send the account number to Elite, and we just say, hey, we need the payment history off of this. Okay, and then there it comes back, and I'll have a 12, 20, whatever the payment history is, and we can just look in there, and then the underwriter has no questions about it, because that payment history for that buyer who's trying to refinance, we can show that, yep, haven't missed a payment, we're good, because it's not going to be on the credit report what the buyer's payments are there. All it's going to be is the underlying mortgage. So, but that's a great question. Any others? Josh.
You've probably dealt with a lot of the like buyer objection handlers, right? Working on the finance side. What are some real common objections initially for somebody who's not ever worked with a buyer in a seller finance scenario?
So, okay, so like what are the buyer's concerns about looking at a seller finance home?
I'm going to ask you about the seller too, so
Yeah.
because I don't think Jax
So-
will go too much into detail on that stuff.
By the time the buyer comes to me, the agent has normally resolved a lot of the objections on it, and I'm not doing a loan for them, but a lot of times what I'm doing with the buyer is evaluating if the seller wants to be out of that contract in 2 years. Okay, then my job is to make sure that that buyer has the capacity to refinance that loan within a couple of years. So that's the main thing that I think, if a buyer's coming in there with a shorter term contract, if it's a 30-year contract, the buyer normally doesn't care, because they're like, hey, as long as I make my payment. So
One that I could see being fairly common, and I know it was, back kind of I better just hold on to this for
Yeah.
a second, because I'm going to just keep them coming for you. But
Okay.
Is the like the appraisal? What if the property value falls?
Well, you don't have to do an appraisal with it. I mean, what happens if they take out a mortgage and the property value goes down? I mean, it's the same thing. There's really not too much of a difference in there. But that's a good question. But yeah, they would have that, and they don't have to have an appraisal. Lee?
Truthfully, Josh, if they've been out looking at houses, they know that value of that house. And if it goes down, yeah.
Okay.
And
okay.
I got one. That's why I grabbed the microphone. How do I write off my taxes when the house is still in the name of the seller? Buyer concern, the property taxes, because Elite is paying those, or the mortgage company is paying those, but I want to be able, as the buyer, to write off the taxes, but the house isn't in my name.
So if it's a contract for deed,
Right.
the documents that they get, I mean, they can write off the interest. The seller will write off their portion of their interest. The buyer writes off their portion. The seller has to pay taxes of income for receiving the difference. But the buyer would be able to the buyer would be able to write off the taxes, because they're including them in the payment for the escrows. So technically, that's their privilege. It's their privilege to be able to do that. So. Here, hold on.
Thank
He's
you.
close enough. Here, you can bring that one back to Josh, and I'll bring this one here.
Thanks.
All right.
So as you're writing your offer, can you write a blank addenda saying buyer to have, to take the tax benefits? Is that something that you
So
can?
I don't have a real estate license. That's a great Dave question, but I would think so, yeah. So your slides done? Well, I think Josh still has. Yeah, my slides.
Oh, yeah, they are. So the best way to think about seller financing is the only difference between what a buyer can do when seller financing versus getting a regular mortgage is that the seller's the bank. They get all the other benefits. It's just that the seller's the bank. So they get to write off the property taxes because they're paying the property taxes. They get to write off the interest because they're paying interest. That's why you go through an escrow company, because at the end of the year, the escrow company will send them a 1098, just like a bank gets. It says you paid $10,000 in interest on your contract. The seller gets a 1099 from the escrow company saying you received $10,000 in interest from your contract. And the seller gets a 1098 from their underlying mortgage company saying that you paid $8,000 in interest to your underlying mortgage. How much does the seller pay taxes on? $2,000, just the difference. So the best way to explain it to people is you get everything any other buyer would get. The only difference is the seller is the bank. Okay?
Since you have the microphone, Dave,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask on some of the same common objections that you have initially with the seller who's never been educated on this process. What are some of the common objections
Well,
that they have?
the first thing, can we say thank you very much, George?
Yeah.
I appreciate his time.
Thank you, George.
He's got an airplane to catch, so I didn't want to keep him too long. So the sellers, they have all sorts of questions. And that's why it's good to be very versed on this. What if they don't make their payments? I said, well, okay. If you rent the house to somebody, how much are you going to get for a security deposit? 1 month for $1,500, $2,000? What if they don't make their payments? Well, I'll evict them. What if they trash the house? Well, I've got $1,500 to pay the... Wait a minute. On a seller financing contract, what if they don't make their payments? Well, on a contract for deed, I'd kick them out in 30 days. 27 days more. Okay. Well, what if they trash the house? Well, I got $50,000 down, not $1,500. Which is better, $1,500 or $50,000? Is that a trick question? Seller financing is always better in terms of security for the seller than renting a house. Go ahead.
I'm going to just keep throwing them at
Go
you
ahead.
because I don't think you're reading my mind on everything, right? Yeah. But so what about, so the seller wants to be able to quote unquote take their interest rate with them. All right. So let's imagine having this dialogue like you're having with the seller. And what happens if the seller then says, well, what if the interest rates come down lower than the interest rate I'm giving them and then they pay me off
That could happen.
You know, so how do you prevent that from happening? I know
can't.
Jax has a good solution for
I
it.
can't. Well, you could put a prepayment penalty in there.
Okay, prepayment penalty. That's kind of what I wanted to hear.
Most buyers don't like that.
But they like seller financing.
If
they can't
interest rates
qualify for a
come
loan.
down,
Yeah.
and the seller went out and got a new mortgage at the higher rates, interest rates come down, the buyer refinances. What can the seller do with their mortgage?
Well, obviously
They can
would
refinance too.
Theirs. Yeah.
I've had a number of sellers who've done seller financing, and they're getting $800, $900 a month positive cash flow. 4 years later, the buyer calls them up and says, we're selling the house. They're going, no, don't do that. Why? Well, they got used to that income. Everybody pull this out real quick, this sheet. This may answer some of your other questions too, okay? This is a spreadsheet that I developed for me to use. I sit down with sellers and I show them the benefits of seller financing. It's been an incredibly powerful tool for me. And what I do is on the left, you see the buyer's contract. So the contract for deed, they're all included. So it's the buyer's sales price, their down payment, their interest rate, and an amortization of the buyer's contract. In the middle, you see the seller's mortgage, the current balance, the interest rate on their mortgage, their principal and interest payment. And then the very right, there's a comparison of the buyer's payment minus the seller's payment. And on the very right-hand side, you see that and this is a real example, by the way, I don't make this up. The seller is making $1,790 a month on that contract. That's how they take the benefit to their next house. Now, this also goes to the trouble of calculating a rate of return for the seller. So they have equity of $127,000 still in the house. Well, I said, well, okay, based on that cash flow, what's your rate of return on your remaining equity? And up there in the corner, it says 18%. Seller's going, excuse the language, damn, why don't more people do this? And the answer is they don't know it's possible. And that's what the spreadsheet will calculate for them. And I do it on any particular offer that might come in. And they're going, well, you know, the buyer's offering us 5%. What would I get as a rate of return if we countered at 7%? And then you can show them, okay? And that's the power of this particular spreadsheet. Now down at the bottom underneath, this particular seller goes out and they buy a $650,000 house. Everybody with me? A lot of numbers on this sheet. They get an interest rate, a down payment of 5%. Their mortgage is shown there, and their interest rate is at, what have I got down there? 6.5. So their payment is shown there, but then I subtract out the monthly payment they're getting from their old house. And now I recalculate what their effective interest rate on the new house is, and it's 1.4% is their effective interest rate on the new house, because they're getting the benefit of keeping that mortgage in place. Now, every situation is a little different. That's why it's very handy to have this, so you can calculate it, okay? Now, the other thing I get from people is, say, well, you know, I got $127,000 equity still left in my house. I would like to actually get some of that money out. I said, well, you have cash flow coming in, $1,795. What can I do with cash flow? I can sell it. So people call me and they say, hey, my seller, they closed on a contract for deed 8 months ago. They've got $127,000 in equity. They really have a situation that's come up. They need another $50,000. Is there any way you could pull out $50,000? Yeah, I can, because they have cash flow. I've got an investor who will pay them, or will buy that out, pay them their $50,000. He wants a 12% return on his money. And that's what this bottom thing shows. So they give him, the investor gives the seller the $50,000 down. He pays 12%, which his payment is $500. Now the seller still has $1,200 and some odd dollars coming in. Their remaining return on their equity is 20%. And the payment for that loan came out of the seller's money, the buyer's money. So there are ways to be able to help the sellers get more equity out of their house if they need it. Now, I haven't got time to get into the details, but I've done this many times. So there are ways to do it, okay? That's kind of exciting, because that's probably the number one objection sellers will have. I need more money than just the 10% down. There's ways to get more money for them because they have cash flow. How do banks make money? Yeah. Can a bank have a mortgage and they can turn around a year later and sell that mortgage to somebody else? They can. They do it all the time. I just got thinking, well, if the banks can do it, why can't I do it? And we found ways to be able to do it. Okay? Any other questions? No, you can't ask any more questions. All right, go ahead. By the way, before you ask that question, if you're interested in this spreadsheet, all you have to do is email me at this email address, realtychoice@live.com, and tell me, Dave, I'd like to have that spreadsheet.
Yeah,
and I'll be happy to send it to you.
Killer spreadsheet. Killer.
Okay.
Yeah. So one of the questions too that I'd have, so if I were going to represent a seller and we wanted to force a seller finance, because that's how the numbers are going to work for their next purchase, how do you handle that across MLS, or how do you personally handle that, where it's like, no, we have to do the seller finance in order for this particular deal to work?
You know what? I've actually had sellers who've sold a home on seller financing 5-6 years ago. They had a 30-year contract. They went out and bought a new house. And then 5 years later, they called me and said, Dave, we want to sell our house. I said, okay, great. I said, Dave, I don't want to accept cash. I don't want an FHA loan. I don't want a VA loan. The only way I want to sell my house is on seller financing. That can be kind of hard to explain to a buyer's agent when they call me up. What do you mean they won't accept cash? They want to be able to take that as an investment for them because they have a low interest rate on their home and they like earning 18% return on it. Sorry, they're not interested in selling their house for cash. And I put it in the terms, seller financing only. Yeah. And by the way, I've got a whole bunch of seller financing contracts. See this bald head and brown and gray hair? That's my retirement. I'm officially retired. I get that cash flow to pay my retirement. I only do this for fun. And it's kind of fun. All right, any other questions? We got a whole bunch of other material to get into. Now, one of the things I do want to bring up is if you email me this and say, I want the spreadsheet, we're also going to send you 2 one-hour classes that go over in a lot more detail the same information that we've talked about here. Because I get frequently people say, oh, Dave, it's like drinking out of a fire hose. And I say, okay, well, just email. I'll send you 2 recorded classes or Zoom classes. You can watch them as often as you want, okay? I have other classes too that are available, but I can't talk about them because this is a CE class and we're not allowed to talk about things. You know what I mean? Okay. But there's others available to you so that you can become extremely well trained on seller finance. We don't want to leave you just hanging. Okay, now one of the things I want to make a comment on with George's material, he talked about the seller side of things. So if the seller needs to get another mortgage, what kind of document do they have to have in order to be able to have an underwriter say, we'll take 75% of your payment and offset the underlying mortgage payment so we don't have to count it? What kind of a document does the seller have to have? Yes, it's a document that says lease at the top. So Jax and George, they put their heads together. So we want a contract for deed, but the underwriters want a lease agreement. So let's make up one that says lease agreement to contract for deed. And it is a contract for deed with all the language in it, but at the top it says lease. And it has an automatic paragraph in it that retroactively turns it into a contract for deed as soon as the seller refinances. And the underwriter looks at that and says, oh, lease. I know what to do with that. I can take 75% of that payment to offset the underlying mortgage. I don't count it as income. I just don't have to count the mortgage at all. And they can refinance just well. So George, thank you. Jax, thank you. They're on top of this stuff. So we need to know what the seller needs in order to achieve their goals. Okay? Any other questions on that? All right, I'm starting to run out of time. Okay, I'm going to kind of zip through this stuff. Again, if I'm going too fast, all of this is covered in those classes I'll be happy to send you. Contract for deed, similar to Utah's uniform real estate contract. Can I write over an FHA or VA loan? Now, many years ago, people would say, David. They said it just like my mom used to say it. David, if I do a wraparound over the top of an FHA or VA loan, I could lose my real estate license. So I thought, dang. So I went to the Division of Real Estate, asked them, could I lose my license? They said, Dave, see, they were nicer. Last time we checked, we're the ones that give you your license, not FHA. You cannot lose your license, okay? So we'll start off with that right away. But FHA and VA did come out and they said, look, if an agent or a broker or a title company is caught doing a wraparound over the top of an FHA or a VA loan where title transfers, they can be put on the limited participation list. I don't want to be on that list. That list is put there so that every time I have a client, I take them down to the mortgage company to qualify for an FHA loan. That loan officer is going to check my name against that list. If my name is on that list, my client can't get their FHA loan insured. They're not going to be too happy about that. So what did that directive say? Don't do a wrap around an FHA or VA loan where title transfers. Can I do a wraparound with a contract for deed? Yes, you can. So if it's an FHA or VA loan, what kind of a contract am I going to use? Contract for deed. Very important thing to know, okay? Oh, did I forget something at the bottom? Oh, so contract for deed, seller retains title, buyer has what's called a equitable interest in the property. Many times the buyer says, well, I don't own the house then. No, you do. You have an equitable interest. The seller can't sell it to anybody else. You can sell the house later if you want to. You can have a puppy if you want to. It's not like a lease, okay? All right, let's talk about some other things. Jax will cover a lot of this, so I'm just going to whiz right by. Seller financing addendum. Jack's going to talk about that. Contract for deed. Select other in the box on the seller financing addendum and write in contract for deed because it's not on the form. Okay, so if this is such a wonderful thing, why don't more people do this? Well, the homeowner, how many homeowners know all about seller financing? They don't. So we shouldn't expect them to. But when I have an opportunity to sit down and explain it to them, show them the math, the vast majority of them say, why don't more people do this? The vast majority of them do. But where's the resistance? It's these guys right here. I call up a listing agent and I say, hey, I've got a buyer that's just thrilled about your home and I'd like to present an offer to you and your seller. What? You want to do what? I want to present an offer to you and why am I asking to present the offer to the seller? So I can explain it to the seller. I'm not going to just let the listing agent do it. Just fax it. Well, that's old technology too. Email it to me. Okay, well, it's a seller financing contract. My seller's not interested in that. They haven't heard the offer. Well, I just know that. Do we have a right to interfere with the seller's ability to listen to an offer? What is our responsibility as agents? Present all offers. And I'll get from these agents, I'll say, Dave, why are you wasting my time? Do you see seller financing on the terms? Well, no, but I think your seller should have a right to listen to this offer. I've got a buyer, they've got $130,000 they'd like to put down. They've got excellent income and they'll be able to pay, I shouldn't have to do that. But that's where the problem is. That's not a problem. I understand agents wanting to do the best job for their clients. So if you don't feel comfortable about doing seller financing, then get the experts to help you. You didn't feel comfortable about doing your first deal when you got your real estate license, did you? So that's how we learn, is to get in and do it. This is huge for today's market. But I've been in real estate for over 40 years. I have used seller financing techniques in myriad of different markets, all sorts of situations. These are excellent tools to have in your toolbox. As realtors, our job is to do what? Help our buyers and sellers achieve their objectives. So it behooves us to get these additional talent in our toolbox. Warren Buffett, I love this guy. Very excellent guy. The most important asset you can invest in is what? Yourself. That's right. That's right. Okay, more to think about. Where can we use seller financing? Well, all of these things can be used on seller finance. They go into the MLS as valid comparables. Great for investors. I can use my Roth IRA to buy a house. That's pretty cool. Terrific for flips. I can do a 1031 exchange, quick close. How long does it take to close a seller financing transaction? I've done it in as little as 2 days. That doesn't mean you should. If I'm the buyer's agent, I want to do a due diligence for the condition of the house. I want to do everything else that I normally do. But I've had buyers say, Dave, I'm fine with the house. I need to close on Monday. Jax, can you do a closing on Monday? Dave, you're killing me. Okay, I'll do it for you. And you can close them pretty dang fast. You don't have to play ping pong with an underwriter. 45 days later, we finally close it. Okay. How much are the closing costs for the buyer? $500, $600. That's a whole lot better than 3% of the purchase price. Okay. Now the sellers have typical closing costs. They have to pay us expensive realtors and the title insurance and all those other fees. Okay. So it's not a whole lot different for the sellers, but certainly it's a big difference for the buyers. Okay, benefits. We close on a HUD-1 statement. They get a title insurance policy. We close with legal documents. It's valid for a comparable for an appraiser. Payment should always be made to a third-party escrow company, never directly to the seller. I've actually had situations where the seller got the payment and they go, money, I know what to do with money. And they go out and spend it. I'll make that mortgage payment later. And all of a sudden the buyer gets a little tag on their door saying this house is in foreclosure. Not a happy thing, okay? Always use a third-party escrow company. The buyer makes their payments to the escrow company makes the underlying mortgage and sends the difference to the seller, okay? We've already gone over that, so I don't want to go over it again. If the seller is primary residence, any additional value on the house that I get because I can sell it for more money is 100% tax-free. Up to $500,000 for a married couple, up to $250,000 if you're single. Now, if I'm an investor, is there a tax benefit for doing seller financing? Yes. I'm an investor. I'm tired of doing a rental property. I sell it seller finance. I can get 10% above appraised value. Most investors say, well, I don't want to sell my house because I don't want to pay capital gains. Okay, that's legit. But if I get $50,000 more for your house, your buyer's paying your capital gains. And not only that, but I can use the installment method in my accounting, and I can spread the gain over the life of the contract. So I just take a little bit of the gain each year. I don't have to declare the entire gain in the year of the sale. When is the taxable event on a contract for deed? The day I sell it, not the day I get all my money back. Okay? Now, it may be that the investor says, well, I just had a huge capital loss that year. Well, I have the option to take the entire gain in the year that it sells to offset that capital loss if I choose. So a huge benefit to invest. I had an agent that did property management, and they came up to me and they said, Dave, I think I just hit a gold mine. I have 300 landlords. I could sell a lot of these houses, seller financing. And they went out and did that. So this is very valuable information to know from an investor's point of view as well. All right, this is the part that Jax really likes. It's time for a break. Dave, shut up and let him go have a break. Okay, so bottom line is we're out there to help more people, aren't we? This is our job. Guys, go out and do your job, okay? So we'll take a break. I'll be here to answer any questions. Again, if you want the spreadsheet and those classes, you have to email me because I won't send them to you otherwise, okay? Thank you very much. Sure. Okay, so primary residence. So if I've lived in my house 2 out of the last 5 years, then any gain is 100% tax. So if I have a house that will only appraise for $500,000, and I tell my seller, I can sell it for $550. That extra $50,000 I got is 100% tax.
Up to $500,000 for America.
Yes, up to $500,000 for married couples. Okay? So that's huge for them. If it's an investment, it's a taxable gain, but I can use the installment method and spread it over the life of the contract.
So now I have a couple of questions, and it's not in terms of solar finance, but just how it is, as best as you know. I'm in a situation where my home has appreciated. Thank you. Did you have another question?
No, it's getting personal, so.
Oh, okay. Over 500,000 since I purchased it 20 years ago. How is that gain?
The first $500,000 is tax free. Anything above that is a long-term capital.
Now, if I spend $100,000 finishing the basement,
then you get to add to your basement.
Okay. Because that, I mean, I'm watching it because I don't want my house to appreciate it more.
No, it's always good.
As long
No,
as
don't let your taxes determine what you should. If my house went up $1 million and I sold it, I get $500,000 tax free. The other $500,000, but I got $1 million out of it. For sure. I'm not gonna shoot myself in the foot and say, well, I'm never gonna sell it.
My next question is it possible to, so I've got, if I get to the point where I want to live, that's an account. Well, my accountant doesn't know. And
You can stop.
Nobody's ever given me like a square
property into a primary residence.
Yeah. And have
There's certain tax deductions.
but it's not as easy as living in it for 2 years.
Well, no, if you live in it for 2 years, then most of it, but I'm not an accountant.
I know, I get it. Yeah.
Your capital gains should be subject to the this rules.
Yeah. Because I have asked CPAs and all sorts of people, and nobody can give me a straight answer on.
You know what? The other rule that I use, all the time, this is just me, so I'm taking it back. I converted a rental property to my primary residence. I live in it for 2 years. I show on my taxes, I sell it. I show them it's my primary residence. They ask me, was it your primary residence? I said, yes. What was your gain? I said, well, it was $400,000, tax free. Let them audit me. And the probability is
because I'm
that they won't.
depreciating them and I'm doing all, I mean, there's all that other, I mean, I've got this lingering tax liability, but I'm waiting to see how that.
Ask me good example.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Jorge.
Jorge,
So much value. Nice meeting you.
I think so, yeah.
So I'm gonna do an offer on a property that is not offered over on seller. How would you how can I convince
You can't
better
give this,
presentation?
you can't give this into what? The starter is you have this in your toolbox.
Okay.
So when you're sitting down with the seller, you plug in your underlying mortgage, and you're able to show them what kind of rate is. That is huge for them.
And with sellers, I think it's a better line of communication. I just want to get my own seller. Keep it vanilla. I get that figured out. So that for me, I'm talking about getting past the listing.
Well, what I do is, if I call listing agent and say, I'd like to present an offer to you and yourself, if I start to get a lot of pushback, I just tell them, I say, look, I understand your reservation and me talking with the seller. But this is a legit offer. I would love. So, welcome back from the break. I hope you got a little bit of food, made some phone calls. You're energized and ready to go again. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Jax Pettey. He's an attorney with First Liberty Title. Now, I've done business with First Liberty Title for over 35 years. And I've used Jax Pettey. Now, you look at him, you go, wait a minute. That doesn't add up. Well, okay, you got me. It was his dad, Jax Pettey Sr., when I first got started, okay? Junior took over, but he's every bit as good. And so I've been working with First Liberty Title for many, many years. One of the great benefits is these guys know seller financing inside and out. They're the premier title company for seller financing. They'll explain it, they'll go over it, they'll make sure both buyers and sellers are totally up to speed on what they're doing. Very, very important. Now, I want to make a few comments about the class too. As a realtor, I got 18 hours of continuing education that I have to do every 2 years. I love it when I can go do a CE class and it's free.
And there's lunch.
And there's lunch. And it's core. Yay! But more important, above all the others, is I walk out of that CE class and I go, wow, I can use this information to help more people. To make more commissions, yes, but even more so, I can help more of my clients. And that's why I'm in this business. So for the next little while, we're going to have Jax come up and talk about seller financing from the legal side of view. So he'll talk about default remedies. He'll talk about all sorts of things. Ask him any question you want, and he can answer it. Jax?
Thank you, Dave. All right, so I'm going to use the lapel microphone. Hopefully you can hear me. It is, Dave. It is. I know you like to sing, though, so I didn't want to take that.
Another day.
Yes, he's not only handsome, he can sing, believe it or not. I wanted to answer some questions that were asked previously. And a couple of those I think Josh asked, so I'll wait till he gets back. But one that I wanted to ask you is this. Are there more or less potential transactions today than 3 years ago?
Potential?
Yes, potential. There's quite a bit more. If you think about real estate as kind of a river with buyers and sellers constantly flowing through, you have the river, and then somebody puts a dam up, right? What are some of the dams you guys face as agents? Interest rates. What else? Inventory. Excellent. COVID was another one. 9/11, another one, right? The thing that I want you to understand is the why of why we teach this class. I also teach an assumptions class. I teach classes that help agents when the market cycles to do more business, not less, right? And I kind of am passionate about it. I've got an agent that became a good friend. We got to know this agent because our law firm filed bankruptcy for the agent. It is. But within a little over 4 years from taking the class, that agent had made $2.2 million net off of the information we shared. So that may be you, it may not. But what I really want to do is, like, when other people put up the dam and you start having the water build up back here, I had an agent came to the class that we taught last month, and he came up and thanked me because last year was his best year ever, and he's a very successful agent. And if you can figure out how to do all these deals that are backing up that other agents can't, like, you're going to do well in the good times like all the other agents, but you're going to do extremely well when everyone else is thinking it's time to panic. So I'm going to get into my slides. And just so you understand the focus, like, we're going to go over the theory, right? We want you to understand, yes, we want you to understand break time, exactly. But we want you to understand the theory behind it because I don't want you to make mistakes. And I see a lot of agents that leave the class. In fact, I had one at the break come up and say, hey, I've taken this class before. It all makes sense in the class. And then I get out of the class and I get phone calls and yes, it was you. And the problem I see with that type of thinking is this. Your job isn't to go to law school and to study the laws behind this and to know and understand how TRID and how RESPA and how the CFPB and all of these things might affect a seller financing transaction. It's not to become a lender and understand all of the guidelines you need to know to help your clients do seller financing safely. And it's not to be a broker that's done it for 40 years before you do your first deal, right? Your job is to go and help people. I had a phone call that was awesome this morning. I had an agent that came to the class. It was a team. They went out and talked to people they thought it might work for. And they have 5 deals. And a lot of those are actually very large deals now because they just opened their mouth. So that's your job, right? How are you going to market it? I'll take care of, helping you understand the theory. But also, you can do like another agent did this morning. They said, I think I know enough to be dangerous, so I'm sending you the offer. And we spent a half hour on the phone going over the offer. And I don't tell people what to do, but I said, you may want to consider doing this. This might benefit your client. And then it's incredibly edifying for them to say, this has been reviewed by a real estate attorney, and here are some of the things that he recommended, right? So you don't need to know everything to do seller financing, but you do need to know who to call to keep you from making mistakes. And Josh is actually fairly knowledgeable, and you have other resources. But your job is to figure out how to monetize the information, right? You don't have to understand everything about the theory. So how would you teach this is how I want you to take notes. Not, oh, that's a great point, but how would I teach that great point to who? Your client, exactly. Who else? Sphere of influence, excellent. Seller, yeah. Who might be your biggest obstacle you have to teach? The other agent, right? So that's okay. And I've probably taught close to 10,000 agents, so you're going to find a lot less resistance than you would 15 years ago. But try to get down here, right? Not the 7% if just you listen to me, but down in the how would you teach this to others? So I'm going to give you some things to write down. And this first one is one that you've probably written down before. So I'm going to give you a key, and that key is how to not give legal advice. So I love people that come to the class the first time, and I will ask them, okay, you've been told not to give legal advice. Would you feel comfortable standing in front of the person in black robes and explaining why what you did was or was not legal advice? Right? Nobody ever shoots their hand up like, sure, that'd be awesome. If you tell somebody what to do, you've given them legal advice. And this applies to all of your transactions. So if you tell somebody what to do, you've given them legal advice. If you use phrases, the smart kids are writing this down, such as, in my opinion, or based on the comparables, this is what most sellers might list at. That's much better for you so that you don't end up getting sued or having a complaint filed, especially if it's in writing, right? So be careful what you put in writing. This is the second thing I'd have you write down. The SAFE Act. If you haven't noticed, the federal government, if it's a really bad piece of legislation, they'll come up with a really good name for it. The SAFE Act essentially says your sellers are now mortgage underwriters and can determine the buyer's ability to make a payment. If you do what I like to do, which is have your buyers pre-qualified by a lender, that's a much better way to do it than task the seller to do it. So, final kind of housekeeping items. The Consumer Finance Protection Bureau is over all real property financing transactions, especially those that have to do with the primary residence. So if you have a seller, right, it doesn't affect buyers, but if you have a seller that's going to do multiple transactions within a year, more than 3, please have them contact either myself or somebody that can explain to them the additional things they need to do to not be considered a lender that's circumventing lending guidelines. Now, this last one I actually love, and that is you do not need seller financing to be TRID compliant. So you don't have to send out disclosures 3 days before. You don't have limits on interest rates. It's a good thing, right? So now let's get into more of the meat. And Josh, now that you're back, no, you're good.
Sorry, class.
In fact, If you had anything to do with bringing us out here, will you stand up? Thank you for standing up. Josh, you also did. Would you stand up? Can we give them some applause? Because that, like, it takes a lot to actually make this happen. Like, do all the logistics and the signups and everything else. So Josh had asked a question about what happens if you do, I think your example was a 2-year contract, and the property value goes down. And now the buyer has a situation where if they go to refinance, maybe there's a negative equity situation. So I lived through, how many of you guys lived through like 2008, right? Okay, I'd done a lot of these before 2008, and we saw that circumstance. And almost every time, in fact, I didn't experience one where this didn't occur. The sellers signed a modification of the note or modification of contract to extend the deadline until such time as the property appraised for a sufficient amount to refinance it. Now, a wise agent might write that down as, I would just put that in my offer. I would put in that if for whatever reason it doesn't appraise when it's time to refinance, there's an automatic 1-year extension. Can you do that? Yes. So because of Josh's question, you guys got information that other classes don't receive. Somebody asked about the all-inclusives, putting a request for reconveyance in escrow. That's another thing that generally we don't get into, that you guys have received. Lease options. This is critical from a legal point of view. Dave was kind enough to teach you that options can be sold and purchased, leases cannot. So any first-year law school that's taken a drafting class would tell you, and they would be correct, you should have a separate lease and a separate option. Why? Because if they're combined, you can't sell the lease. And if you can't sell one of the parts of a document, you can't just tear it in half and say, here, you can have this part, right? So if you're doing a lease option, make sure it's a separate lease and separate option. It'll benefit your buyer. And also if you're doing something where you're using it for qualifying for a future loan for the seller, it's a very good thing to have. I think that was most of the house cleaning that I had written down. So let's go into your seller financing addendum. Now, when I call it your seller financing addendum, I don't mean you created it, because all of you seem intelligent. And so I know you didn't create it. But there are some issues, and in the 1-hour class I came and did, I told you I would come back and I would go through those issues with you, and now we have time to do that. I understand this was not written by an attorney that's done a lot of litigation when it comes to this, and probably I don't understand some of the things in it. So I want you to understand what I don't understand, and maybe you can explain it to me. So the first thing I don't understand is in 1.1, creation of documents, why it goes against all other contracts that you have to deal with. Let me give you an example. The REPC, when it comes to closing costs, does it say those are all to be paid by the buyer or all to be paid by the seller or split evenly? Split evenly, right? Makes a lot of sense. So why does this document all of a sudden make whoever selects, like whoever happens to be in touch with somebody that knows how to do these types of transactions, why do they get penalized with having to pay for any costs associated with that? Doesn't make sense to me. So this is in your handout. I would write on your handout in section 1.1 that you'll need to do some sort of addenda that indicates that the cost would be split. The costs are fairly nominal. It's usually like $135 a side. But that's the first one. And a lot of things I'm going to save till the next addendum we're going to go through. But this is the second one that doesn't make sense to me. Okay, and I understand. Well, I should ask, do we have any licensed lenders in here? Okay, excellent. I'm so glad you're here. Let me ask you a question. I'm going to ask you a question. If you don't know, just pretend, like mumble, and I'll be like, that's correct. So You need three things to calculate a mortgage payment. You need to know the amount of the loan, you need to know the interest rate, and what else?
Term.
Thank you. Can somebody please show me where the term is on this form? Okay, it's not there. And I get these phone calls all the time, and they usually start with, Jax, you told me if the deal was falling apart to call you because you usually have a way to fix it, but this one's impossible. We have a situation where the seller is demanding a certain interest rate, but the buyer has to have a certain payment, and it's just not going to work. What were they missing? The term. We did a 60-year amortization. Can you do that? Yeah. Can you do an infinite amortization? Yeah, it's called interest only, right? So it's a tool you guys need to have, and I think that's tragic that it's not in the form. So please, on your form, write in term so that you can remind yourself when you go back and look at the notes, oh yeah, that's something we can use to make the deal work for our buyers and sellers. That's the balloon payment. Yes, the balloon payment, if there's a balloon, it infers that it's going to be paid off in a shorter than fully amortized timeline. Yeah. Exactly.
Wouldn't you just put that the remaining will be paid off in 30 years? Wouldn't you put the length of your amortization there if there was no balloon?
What you should do, because that's specifically for the balloon payment timeline, right? You should put this loan will be amortized over 30 years or over 15 years.
Gotcha, to be clear.
Yeah, good question. And I mentioned this when I came the first time. I'm not hiding the ball on this. I went actually and spoke to the entire real estate commission and said there are 10 things you need to fix on your addendum. Anyone remember how many they fixed? One. Anyone remember what it was? They put an addendum number on it for you. So, so that's better than last time, trust me. And I had to actually explain, because one of them asked, well, why do we need an addendum number? I said, because I'm a good enough attorney, I'm 100% confident if both addendums are signed the same day, I can convince the judge mine was signed last. That's why you need an addendum number, right? But I digress. Okay, so late payment, we'll talk about that on the next one. We'll talk about a lot of the terms on the next one, but you'll notice on top, this one only had all-inclusive and note and deed of trust as an option. There are much other ways to do it as well that we'll get into. But I want to hit two more things on your addendum. The first one is actually a good thing, right? It's down here in section 8. Talks about title insurance. And this is, look, my job, like, primarily is your licensing and liability. Okay, I won't close a deal if it's going to cost you or me one of those options. So I will never close an all-inclusive over an FHA loan. Because even though it won't affect your licensing, it affects your ability to potentially do future business. And what's awesome is I'm so glad, like if this was the only thing that came out of this class, somebody came up and said, we were about to close an all-inclusive over an FHA loan, right? And if all I did was save that person from potentially getting banned for life from doing an FHA transaction and their brokerage for 1 to 5 years, like that's kind of scary, right? It's worth it. And we'll go into a slide where it clarifies that. So you don't have to memorize it now, that's for later. But this is title insurance. So this is how you could generate liability as an agent if you don't understand this form, right? This is the buyer going to purchase a lender's policy for the lender? Who's the lender? Seller, right? So imagine you're the seller's agent, and most buyer's agents are going to mark shall not because they're like, well, if I can save my buyer some money, I'll do that. And your seller asks you, hey, should I worry about that? And you respond in email, don't worry, nothing will ever happen. Who just insured their lender's policy? Yeah, the agent and the broker and their E&O, right? So if you are a listing agent, you want to either make sure that your seller selects counters that, yes, there will be a lender's policy, or you want to send a golden email. Now, if you've come to one of my classes, hopefully you remember the golden email. If you haven't, if you do real estate long enough, this will save you either a complaint or a large lawsuit, right? The golden email is this. You tell your client something they should do, they decide not to do it. You get back to your computer, you want to send an email that goes something like this: Dear Mr. and Mrs. Client. I suggested that most people in your circumstance would do this, and you decided not to put a period at the end, not a question mark, right? Because then when it's he said, she said, and the he said is an agent, and the she said is someone from the general public, by the way, in that circumstance, who wins? General public, right? If you don't understand that, trust me on that, okay? But if you have that golden email, you win, right? I've been to the division with agents that had the golden email and won, lawsuits where they won, because judges don't know the truth. They're not omnipotent, but they know what the evidence is. And if it's he said, she said, but one of you sent that golden email, you should win that case, right? If you want to know 100% whether you win, tell me who the judge is, what they had for breakfast, and if they fought with their spouse that week, and I'll give you a very good guess. But besides that, I would say golden emails are a good thing. So we've talked about why the form has title insurance, and why as a listing agent, you would want to recommend that to your seller, especially if they have significant equity, because at the point they sell, they're no longer an owner, and their old owner's policy isn't in effect, right? Even if they quit claim from themselves to their LLC, it more than likely voids that policy. So you want to cover their equity. Yes, you had a question.
I just had a quick follow-up to the golden email.
Yes.
I'm a broker, and I tell my agents to get stuff like that all the time.
Yes.
Is there value? Well, does it become extra golden if you ask confirmation, or is it okay just sending that off?
It's situational, right? You always would prefer confirmation, but you have to know who you're dealing with, right? So with me, if I believe I'm going to get a response, I'll ask for confirmation and follow up with a call to get confirmation. If it's one of those clients that is seldom right but always certain, yeah, the women always know what I'm talking about when I say that, then I might just end with a period, because if I do ask for confirmation in the email and I don't get it, now I've compromised the value of the golden email. So it's one of those things where you have to almost look into the crystal ball, right? But if you do ask for confirmation, you really need to make sure you get it. You bet. That's a great question. I don't know if I had that one before. All right, let's talk about another issue with this, right, that I don't understand. I don't understand why they would give you a form that might get you sued if you use it incorrectly. How do you get sued with this form? I'll give you the example, right? I'm going to buy a house, me, Jax Pettey, and I use you as my agent. And the way this form gets filled out or countered by the seller, I'm going to be providing credit reports, work history, where I've lived, a bunch of information. Do you guys see a problem yet? Even worse than that, right? Let's say I'm old school and I fax that information to your brokerage. You're not by your fax machine at the brokerage every day. And eventually it makes it to you, and you send it to the other agent, and the other agent sends it to a seller, and somebody steals my identity. Who gets sued? It starts with E. Right, ends with everybody, right? Yes. So if you are a broker, teach your agents not to touch that toxic information. There may have been a time when that would have been okay. Now is not that time, right? So let me just ask you, how many of you received an email or a request from a title company, hey, we need you to get your client's social and date of birth, right? Please have that sent directly to the title company, not through you. I know these sound like obvious things, but obviously I'm stating them because somebody paid life's tuition to figure that out instead of learning vicariously. So don't touch that. And I would much rather have you, instead of using this form and having that go through you, or even directly to your seller, right? Have it go to a lender whose staff is trained on how to deal with that information, that provides a letter to the seller explaining the status of the buyer, which also solves for SAFE Act qualification. So anyway, it can be done extremely easy and safely, but you guys need to make sure and protect yourselves while doing it. All right, so I love that we can crumple that up and throw it away. Now, this one is also in your form, in your handout. I love helping agents, but I became very tired of having to help them draft a one-page addendum to fix the seller financing addendum. So I finally just drafted my addendum that I let agents use. There's no charge for it. I'm not trying to make any money off it. And I was able to verify from the last time I was here, it just says if drafted by an attorney. It doesn't say specifically for one of the parties, but anyway. So yes, you can legally use it. Yes, Josh?
That's good, because I remember big question marks.
Yes.
So that's awesome.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and the one I'm going to email you actually has some additional updates. Anytime, like you guys are going to think I'm a nerd and do nothing but study this stuff, but anytime there's a case that might affect it or some additional information that might be beneficial, I'll modify the form and send it back out. Would you guys like me to email you this form? Yes. Okay. I will email it to everyone that signed up for the class. In response, would you mind leaving a review? We like to do our reviews instead of a little paper, kill trees. We like to do them online. Just go to Google and say, that was awesome. If you really hated it, that's fine. You could leave that too, but I would, again, not understand. All right, so this one in credit documents also includes a contract for deed, right, as an option. It's something where your clients need to understand that the more tools you have, the more tools they have, and the better you can represent them. Sellers generally prefer a contract for deed. Buyers generally prefer an all-inclusive. I'll sometimes have people ask me, what's my favorite document, right? I don't have a favorite unless I know what I am in the transaction. If I'm the seller, I generally want to sell on a contract. So I buy and sell a lot of properties on seller financing, right? I bought one end of last year. I paid $270 for it, and within 2 weeks I resold it for $440. It needed $68,000 worth of work, and instead of me paying my guys to do anything, I required that my buyer do all the repairs. And he's not only now done those repairs, he's put an ADU in, so if I take it back, like, it's a valuable property now, right? There are some people that think, oh, I need to buy a property, spend the 68 grand to fix it up to get the 440. If you're intelligent enough to understand the value of providing the financing with the asset of the house, you don't need to do that, right? So if you're working with investors that are taking out hard money loans to fix up the properties, you guys can be rock stars, right? But even better, why aren't you doing it, right? The agents that make the most money, they figure out how to do it for their clients and for themselves. All right, financing terms, you'll see that it does have amortized over, right? You want to fill that in. Please don't leave it blank. Now, another thing that I put in the form, because clients were coming back and saying this is really valuable for our clients, was that you can select what day of the month the payment is due on. Sellers really like that, because if the buyer's payment's due on the 25th and their payment's due the next month on the 15th, the chances of the seller's payment being late is significantly reduced. Would you agree with that? Yeah. But buyers like it too, including myself. Most of the commercial properties I've purchased are on seller financing, and most of them I have payments due on the 20th, because that just works for me, right? I've got a set of invoice bills that'll come in on the 1st. I've got a set that come in on the 20th. It works well. So that's when you can use to make it work for your clients. Late payment penalty. There's one thing I'm going to say you need to write down in your notes, and that is, if there's an underlying loan, please do not do more than a 5-day grace period, right? So again, the smart kids are writing that down. Here's why. I've seen where there's a 10-day grace period. I got this call. Jax, I want you to sue my buyer. Okay, what is your buyer doing? Well, they're making their payment. This was genius, right? They had written a 15-day grace period in to the seller financing. By the way, when I said it's genius, I was being not only sarcastic, but a bit pedantic. Why would I think that's a bad idea?
Because by the time you figure all this out, it could be like 25 days, or your payment could be later.
Yes. If you give buyers a 15-day grace period, when do they pay? 16th. I love that. Yeah. And understand, they can pay on the 16th and they're not late. Most people don't understand grace periods. If the payment's due on the 1st, when does the grace period start ticking off? The 2nd, right? So when you say a 5-day grace period, that still gives somebody till the 6th before they'd be hit with the late payment penalty. But if you do a 10 or a 15-day grace period, and this one, they wanted me to sue the buyer because the buyer was paying on time and they were getting hit with the late payment penalty. And I said, look, you can pay me a bunch of money to lose a lawsuit for you, which I'm not going to do because I don't do that. Or you can just get a payment ahead with your mortgage because you should have done a 5-day grace period. You didn't. And that's the best and least expensive solution. I'm hoping this is valuable for you to go through. I really am, because I do want you to get it. All right, so let's talk about the next item. Escrows. If you know what the taxes and insurance are, I think it's best to disclose that to the clients so the buyer knows what they're going to be paying. If you want to know exactly what it's going to be, you get that from the seller's mortgage statement, right? So I always, on the ones I am offering on, will request a copy of the seller's mortgage statement as part of seller's disclosures. I would recommend you do that as well. On late payment penalty, let me just touch on a question that you're going to get asked. Your seller's going to ask you, what should I charge, right? You shouldn't tell them what they should charge, but I can tell you what the average seller puts in. They'll put in 10% and 10%. 10% late payment penalty and 10% default interest. You can negotiate more or less than that, but now you know what the average is. All right, so let's continue. Balloon payments. When I started doing this, there were a lot of balloon payments on seller financing. Currently, we see far fewer balloon payments on seller financing. I think that's because agents are doing a better job at helping their sellers understand the value of making money off of the bank's money. Most of the time, you just have to ask them a question. You're making 18% interest on a property, on an asset that's secured by real property, where depending on how you did it, if everything goes wrong, you get the property back and I get to resell it as your agent, right? What better investment do you have than that? What do you have that's secured by real property paying 18%? Because most investors would love to buy it. And when they think of it that way, most sellers understand the value of not having a quick balloon payment. And to go to Josh's question, we are seeing a lot of prepayment penalties. The biggest one I've ever seen was 30 years, $100,000, right? So you could make it so it's not favorable for the buyer to pay you off. And I haven't seen a lot of resistance from buyers on that, but both of those are valuable tools for you to have. The due on sale clause is another thing that most people don't understand you can contract around. Now, let me be clear. This is not the due on sale clause on the underlying mortgage. There's nothing you can do to make the bank so they can't call the due on sale clause if they decide to. By the way, I love asking this question. Of the people here, raise your hand if you've intentionally violated a due on sale clause. One? Okay, so that's shocking to me that none of the rest of you have written a REPSI. Like, how did that happen? You've got to understand, the way those clauses are written is so broad, any actual or potential transfer of a beneficial interest is a violation of the due on sale clause, including a lease of more than 3 years, right? A REPSI, you can actually take that, go to court, do a specific performance lawsuit, and have a judicial deed transferring ownership to the buyer executed by the court. Like, it is a violation of the due on sale clause, but none of you are afraid of it. There's a reason why people that do a lot of seller financing are not afraid of the due on sale clause. Now, there are some exceptions. Okay, I'm going to give you the glaring red light exception. It's 2 words. The first one is the great state we live in. Anyone want to guess the last one? Thank you. So say both of them. Utah housing. Utah housing, I get this call about once a year, right? The call, most recent one, was less than a year ago. Very panicked agent who had done an all-inclusive over Utah housing FHA loan. Utah Housing will look at the tax notice and start foreclosure. That's how banks find out most of the time. They don't have to go research the title. The tax notice shows who's on title. Now, every time so far we've done that, we've reclosed it as a contract for deed, putting the seller back on title, and they have not done the foreclosure, right? That doesn't mean they couldn't. It just means they haven't. But this is on the seller financing, is there going to be a due on sale clause, right? So I like to buy and sell. I will get you just 1 second. I always select that there shall be no due on sale clause on the contemplated financing, right? I have an agent I spoke to this morning. They came to the last class. They have since found a property that they're picking up. Do you know the total amount the seller's going to walk away with? $2,500. Now, there's no equity in the house. Why would those people buy that house? Because the value's in the interest rate, right? On that one I bought, my interest rate's 3.5%. I resold it at 8%. Even if there was no equity in the house, that's a pretty awesome return. I think so. But one of the things we went over, because they had not selected there shall be no due on sale clause, was if it was me, I would select that, because if somebody comes up to you and says, I'll give you another 50 grand and a 7.5% interest rate, that would be a smart deal to do for you, right? So if you're on the buy side and you're buying on seller financing, why would you want to handicap yourself from selling on seller financing? Now, people will make that offer to me and I'll accept it. Why? Because I'm okay having 2 people on the hook to make the payment instead of just 1. I don't feel like that damages me. So, yes, Josh.
I think this is great stuff, right?
Thank you.
How do you execute that? I'm just kind of curious from a logistics standpoint. You have more than one contract for deed that's in place on this. So what does
Great
that
question.
just what does it look like for us?
So for you, it's pretty simple in the sense that you're going to close the transaction, the second transaction, just like you would the first transaction. You can only sell the interest you have. So if you bought on an all-inclusive, you can sell on an all-inclusive or a contract for deed. If you buy in a contract for deed, you have to sell on a contract for deed. But you want escrow companies in both circumstances, preferably the same escrow company, because then end buyer makes their payment, which pays that account, which automatically pays the first seller finance, which pays the original seller's loan. Yeah.
Thank you.
You bet. And if you guys aren't thinking, wow, I should go out and find a property and do that, hopefully you should be. And you asked the question first, but Josh is so cool. I just had to take this. Go ahead.
Liz is cool too.
Yes. Whoa.
Oh, somebody else was back there that had a question.
Yeah, it was this guy had a question first. You know, I don't care what he calls himself. It's cool today, right? Liz, Robert, whatever you want to.
I'll be Jorge.
Jorge? I like it. Got a good friend named Jorge.
So, and this could just be the nitpicky person in me, but
Yeah.
why do you have an option to check for the due on sale if one of the options is there shall be no due on sale?
Because sometimes a seller is filling out this form.
That's what I was gonna ask. Which one do I check if I'm the buyer or the seller?
If you're a buyer's agent, it's generally going to benefit your buyer to check the second box.
But then wouldn't you just leave the due on sale box unchecked as well? Wouldn't that be the same?
Well, no, because if you check the second box, there's not going to be a due on sale clause on the seller financing to this buyer. If you don't say anything or check the first box, there will be a due on sale clause in the seller financing.
Okay, because they're using templates usually,
right,
to just make that happen.
Correct.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know.
Yes. Good question. Okay.
I have a question too.
Oh, Liz had a question
I'm
as
Liz.
well.
Way over here. I'm here.
Oh, Liz, sorry. And then she had one too.
Okay.
Yes. We'll give it. But
Okay, so due on sale, and I'm just kind of curious, is this myth or fact? I've heard that when people are doing seller financing because the underlying mortgage is so low and the bank goes, well, why would I accept seller financing? Why would I keep this loan at 3.5% when I could go out and make this buyer get another loan at 7.5? I've heard that they're calling them due. And
Yes.
I'm just curious if that's.
I love that question. So would you guys do me a favor? Whenever anyone's like, oh yeah, they're calling him due, right? I think I would know. Would you please do me the favor and ask them, What address are you referring to? Yes, because inevitably when you ask that question, well, I don't know, I just heard it from somebody else. Oh yeah, if it's on the internet, it's got to be true, right? But let me explain why that's not as much of an issue today versus the old days, right? In the old days, you would go to the bank on the corner, and the bank on the corner would give you a loan, and they serviced the loan, and it was their money off of their lines they were lending. Today, you have fractionalized mortgage interests that they'll select a servicer to service the loan. Now, George, I wish he was here, he explained this to me, and it made perfect sense, right? Servicing models are, the servicing company has to buy the rights to service the loan. So we'll use simple numbers. If my business model is, I'm going to pay $1,000 to buy the servicing rights, and then I'm going to make $100 a month. And it doesn't matter what the underlying interest rate is, because I only get paid if I service it. Do I want that revenue stream to stop? No. Right? I actually had a really unintelligent, like must have done mail order law degree guy, write a letter to his daughter's mortgage company saying, she did a seller financing. That's clearly a violation of the due on sale clause. The lender sent a letter back saying, thank you, we'll take that into advisement, right? Because it was a servicing company, SPS, like almost all of them are servicing companies. So does that mean universally we're not concerned? No. And would you ever tell your client, don't worry, the due on sale clause can never be called? No, right? But we're not going to go into like all the different companies and how likely it is for each one. I could, but I'd bore you and it would just be like fun for me. But just think of it this way, Utah Housing, be very careful. Is that one? Okay, good. I thought it was like Mothra, but okay. Utah Housing, be very, very careful. I've purchased properties that have Utah Housing loans. I'm very comfortable with it, but you have to do it the right way, okay? If it's a servicing company, your probability is astronomically low, but please don't make the mistake of making any guarantees to your client. Good question. Yes?
So Jax, I was referred to you by another title company because they said, oh, it's an FHA loan and we're not going to touch it.
Yes.
Why would they, I mean, what's the
hesitation? Great question. Hesitation is title companies that can only do all-inclusives should not do seller financing over FHA.
And contract for deed you can.
Yes. Now, so you know, I do not assume, right? Because that makes bad things out of you and me. I don't know if you've seen the word.
Yeah.
But so I had my staff spend 3 weeks calling daily the regional FHA office until they finally figured out we were not going to stop. So I got on a conference call with the regional director, the vice director, and head legal counsel. And I went through the questions with them. And I said, do you still have a limited participation list? Yes, we do. Will doing an all-inclusive over an FHA loan get someone on that list? Yes, it will. That's why they referred you over to me, because the next question was, what about a contract sale? And the head legal counsel said, do you mean like a contract for deed? And I said, yes, and I held my breath for a moment. And he said, that will not get you put on the limited participation list. So what about a lease option? He said, no, that will not get you put on the limited participation list. So because that list exists, any title company that is thinking more about your license and ability to do business than them just getting another transaction should not do seller financing over FHA. Because if all they can do is an all-inclusive, they can't do it. If they can do a contract for deed, they can do it. And again, it's not that it eliminates the due on sale clause, but it eliminates that nuclear bomb that might go off if you get caught.
Okay. And then the other question was, when you were just stating earlier that you purchased the property and then you went and, did another seller financing and sold it. Is there anywhere where you would have to get permission from the previous sellers at all? I mean, is there a clause? Because in 2008, we used to have a clause that if in the event that the buyer chooses to sell, or in an instance of moving out of state or some reason, they would have to try to get out of the contract, they would have to find another buyer.
Okay.
Or they would have to just refinance the loan. Hence, you would sell it to somebody else. But Is there anywhere there? that
Is
there's
there a way to
clause?
do that? This is class participation time. Is there a way to do that?
Well, do on clause, you would say there shall no be, no do on
Exactly.
clause.
If you select that, you are not, they, not only do you not need permission, even if they find out and object, they have no legal standing to do anything about
So
it.
you did it for your buyers, but then you would make sure that.
No,
when
I
you
always
bought
make
it-
sure my sellers, like it's in
Do
my
it for
contracts,
you. Okay.
always.
Okay,
My buyers, if they request it, I'll generally give it to them.
okay, that's what.
And let me tell you why I generally give it to them. On that property, my buyer put down $128,000 and now it's got an accessory dwelling unit in it. If the buyer completes the contract, am I happy? Yes. If they fail, am I excited? Abso-friggin-lutely, right? So for me, the biggest qualification generally comes down to what's the down payment. Because if you set it up correctly for your seller wins either way. If you did an all-inclusive with 10 grand down, your seller might lose. Like that would be a bad thing. And we'll get into the most important slide we're going to go over today, and you'll understand why it's so important to get a lot of money down for certain types of seller financing versus others. Okay, escrow company, always use an escrow company if you're doing it for your clients, because it will simplify your lives and theirs. There are 3 escrow companies that operate in the state of Utah, but only one of them bought you lunch today. Just throwing that out there. And then if you want to select your buyer, like if you have a seller that's like, hey, I want to know everything about this buyer, use this last clause. Buyer shall provide to, I don't know, somebody named George, all their information, and then he can give, or she, whoever you select, can give a letter to the seller that explains the buyer's status. That is such a better way to do it. You're not dealing with toxic information that might get you sued. Sellers don't know which end of a credit report to look at anyway, but also having a professional licensed mortgage officer give an opinion letter puts additional credibility to your buyer. All right, we talked about title insurance on the last one, so unless anyone has questions, I won't rehash that. Hazard insurance. Oh my gosh, why is this not in your MLS form? Let me tell you what happens to agents that don't come to this class. They'll go and they'll do a transaction, and this is about once every 6 months I get this phone call. Jax, we closed on an all-inclusive. There was a fire, $180,000 damage. This isn't made up. This is an actual phone call I received. The insurance is denying the claim because the sellers left their full coverage policy in place instead of changing it to a landlord policy. Newsflash, insurance companies don't get rich by paying claims, and this is a way they can deny the claim. So I would suggest that you as agents, right, wouldn't it be nice if your form said, oh, by the way, you should figure out what to do with the insurance. So as a general rule, if there's an underlying loan that's not being paid off, you would select option 1. If it is paid off free and clear, you would generally select option 2. There are other ways to do it. I've found an agent that will actually show both parties as insureds on the property, which is a very good way to do it. Most insurance agents, their heads catch on fire and they run away, like if you try to have them do that. So it can be done, but those are the 2 most common. Now, would you tell your client you should select this one? No, because that's giving legal advice. You would say, if there's an underlying loan, most of the time, or you could say the attorney that taught the class suggested if there was an underlying loan, that you would select option 1. That's another great way to do it. All right, property taxes. This is another one that should be on your form, right? Imagine you're the seller and you live in Pepperwood, and it's October, and you've paid $12,000 into your escrow account for taxes. And at closing, you see, wait a minute, I'm giving the buyer a $12,000 credit? Anyone see the problem there? Somebody tell me the problem there. Well, the buyer is going to be able to use the money the seller already paid into their escrow account. Yeah, for taxes. So why your seller is going to ask you, why, Mr. or Mrs. Listing Agent, that I am paying a very large commission to, am I paying taxes twice? Right? So I bring that up. Again, you guys don't have to remember everything. If you have the form, it'll walk you through, and feel free to send it. We'll go through it, right? So you don't have any issues. Your job is to go and find the people, not be the 100% expert. But understand when it comes to tax prorations, if the seller's already paid their portion into escrow, maybe you want to select that you will not prorate taxes at closing. And if the buyer agent asks why, because they haven't come to the class, just say, because my seller's already paid that on behalf of your buyer, and your buyer's not going to have to write another $12,000 check in November. It's already in the escrow account. Good information? Good. And I love it when a class gets it, right? You can sense it. You can also sense when they're like, I have no idea what language he's speaking. I think we're in the former category, which is good. All right. Another one that I think should be on your form is a request for notice of default. If you ever personally buy a property on seller financing, please have the title company file a request for notice of default on the underlying loan, right? Or if you sell on seller financing, here's why, right? Let's say you're the buyer and they send notice to the seller, the property is delinquent, they're starting foreclosure. If the foreclosure sale takes place, you're homeless. And you've been paying the payment, right? But if you file a request for notice of default, the attorney has to send you notice. If you're a seller, maybe you move to a different state and they only put notice on the property of the foreclosure. Could that be a problem for you as a seller? Yes, because if you still have $250,000 equity in the property and the foreclosure sale takes place, you no longer have $250,000, right? Why is that not in your form? I don't know. But I would suggest for your clients, you recommend it. And if you do it yourself, you select that you will get a request for notice of default. And I'm not teaching from the standpoint that I think you should already know this, right? I'm teaching because it's valuable information that now you can help you and your clients better with. Property inspections. This one I put in because I don't know if it's just a Utah thing. Maybe people that have done real estate in other states could answer that question. But occasionally you get people that are so emotionally attached to the property, right? They designed it, built it, and they want to make sure that the new owner takes care of it. Anyone ever had a client like that? Okay. If they sell to someone getting a loan and they go back and knock on the door and say, I'm really angry at you because you're not taking care of the property. Maybe their dad built it, right? We call that a restraining order. But if they sell it on seller financing, it might be better for them. And they might like you more as an agent because you presented a way that they could actually make sure the property is taken care of. They can select the box that the seller has a right of inspection. They can also select the box that says no structural alterations without the approval of the seller. Yes. Yes.
So in that case, that kind of goes back to the question I had before. Sorry, that kind of goes back to the question I had before, where you said if you don't check anything, then the default is for it to go that way. Well, in this case, I guess my concern is that if you don't check that, the default templates that everyone has is no structural alterations are allowed. This right here just reaffirms that, but there's not an option to have structural alterations allowed, which would seem very important for cases where I've had to write things to counter this situation for trying to do flips and upgrades to homes. If I'm buying it, as you were saying, to do a rehab to rent or else fix and flip, I don't want to be going back to the seller every time when I'm upgrading their property to a higher quality value.
So I'm glad you asked that question. If you go back and read what's in the template documents, it doesn't talk about structural alterations. It talks about waste being committed on the property.
Actually, mine does say structural alterations, which is why I had to write something to counter that.
So the template on the state webpage that title companies use for an all-inclusive, and the bank notes and trust deeds, they talk about waste, right? You cannot commit waste on the property, which is a fancy way of saying you can't devalue the property.
Yeah. Well, the way how they do it is they don't do it as part of the deed, they do it as part of the note.
Well, and
I
again,
mean,
if
as
they're
far
using a
as-
customized note, I would want to counter that as a buyer.
Yeah, and so I've always had to write something. So it'd be nice to have an option that says we specifically do allow structural alterations on the condition that the property will be modified for its increase in value, not decrease.
Yeah, and I'd be curious to know like whose note you're using that has that in there as the boilerplate.
I could also show you the contract I wrote to fix it.
Good.
You want?
No, it's I'd love to see that. Yeah. But the general contracts that your title companies are going to use with an all-inclusive just have the waste clause. So you want to give your sellers a structural alteration. If they're using one that they've modified, hopefully it was modified by an attorney, that has a structural clause in there, you may need to counter it if your buyer doesn't want it. Okay. This last one is another way to handle the taxes that gets your sellers more money at closing. And that is you have the buyer purchase the balance of the escrow account from the seller, just like they would if they got a new loan, right? They'd put money in escrow with the bank. And then you have that, whatever the escrow balance is, deducted from the payoff when the buyer pays it off. All right, well, we got a couple more. Who's come to my assumptions class? Anyone? Oh, you guys need to come to that. Like there are two things agents are killing it with right now, seller financing and assumptions. So why is that valuable? I'll tell you when I explain this clause. If you're going to do seller financing, like imagine it's your own home you're buying and the seller's giving you a great rate, right? 5.5%, but their underlying rate is 3.5% and it's FHA or VA. Please check this box because imagine if once you pay out the seller's equity, you could assume their 3.5% rate and not pay that for 30 years. How long do you pay it for? If they've only got 15 years left by the time you do that, you're only paying for 15 years. Can you imagine how much money you're saving? Like not just monthly, but when do you pay the most interest on a loan? The beginning, right? If you could sit down with every buyer sitting on the sidelines and explain that concept to them, there would be a bunch getting off the sidelines. Now, George didn't mention this, so I will, right? He actually went out and bought the list of every sub 4% interest rate in the Salt Lake Valley. So the thing we were always missing was, how do you find these sellers that would be so great to either do an assumption or do a seller financing transaction with? He went out and bought it, which I think is pretty cool. But if you're doing seller financing and it's an underlying FHA or VA loan with a great interest rate, please do your buyers a favor. It doesn't cost the seller anything, but it could save tens of thousands of dollars for your buyers and make you guys look like rock stars. Yes. Next assumptions class will be next month. So if you want to get on the list for the classes, just when I send out the addendum, just respond with, I'd like to get on the email for your other classes, and I'll get that to my girl who will get you the registration form. Yes, I would strongly suggest that if I was you, I would come to that class. Okay, this last thing I put in is boilerplate. This is one which it still like boggles my mind a little that it's not on your form, and that is the seller should always owe less to the bank than the buyer owes the seller. Because so far, 100% of the time, when the seller owes more to the bank than the buyer owes the seller doesn't have any money. I'm sure all of your clients, like they have big bank accounts, right? They just write a check. But so far, the experience has been the buyer has to pay that and then try to get it from the seller who doesn't have any money. So it's a good thing to not violate that, yes.
That's what I was gonna ask. So can the seller leverage that house and like HELOC it or do any other type of refi or taking money out? Or is that option, once the seller financing goes through, is that they're cut off from any further claims of like money value in that home?
Very quick. Did everyone hear the question? The answer is dependent upon the type of transaction you did. If you did a lease option, the seller can absolutely keep leveraging the house up. That's why those are potentially dangerous, right? One of the reasons. If they do a contract for deed or an all-inclusive, the seller cannot. So sometimes, right, you'll have a seller that has a home equity line. We did one recently. The sales price was 1.2. The amount of the loan was like 950,000. The seller owed 400,000 on the first, and they had a $200,000 home equity line. There's a lot of equity between what the seller owes and that, right? Now, if you're doing seller financing, there's a home equity line, please call me because there's some additional language I'm going to have you include in your addendum, but I'm also going to put in a hold harmless that protects you guys and our company. Because you can do seller financing where there's a HELOC under certain circumstances with the hold harmless agreement. So if your title company doesn't understand how to do all that, it might not turn out as well, but that's why a lot of title companies just won't, because they don't know how to do that, but it can be done. All right, last thing. This has a transfer of title section, so if the client's doing a contract for deed, they understand how that's going to work. Now, you guys should all be excited because this is the most important slide we're going to go over, followed closely by the second most important slide we're going to go over. This is also in your handouts. I think near the end of the handout, there's some circles on the top. I used to have the realtors draw the circles. That turned out to be a bad idea. But it's going to have strong 4 months legal and down payment. Strong 4 is something that you as agents need to understand. Is this particular document set strong for the buyer or is it strong for the seller? And it is vastly different depending on what document you use. You're also going to have months. That's how many months does the default remedy take? The reason this slide is the most important is because most sellers and buyers just want to know what the risks are, right? They want to know, buyers want to know, and sellers want to know if a payment isn't made, how many months is it going to take before the seller can take the property back, or if you're on the seller side, before the seller can get control of the property back. Legal is going to be the minimum you should expect in legal costs. Please notice I said minimum. And then also down payment. That's what makes the whole thing work. And so what do we see as the average down payments on those? It depends on the document set. Like, it's incredibly different between one or the other. So we've gone over a number of types of seller financing. Why don't you guys give me some? What are some different types you can do? Excellent, thank you. Perfect. That was like even in order. You guys are awesome. I love that. Oh, that is so kind. I might record that and send that to my kids. In fact, great question. So that's why it says all-inclusive / trust deed. For those of you who didn't hear the question, what about a normal trust deed and note? The default remedy is exactly the same for an all-inclusive trust deed or just a trust deed and note. For bonus points, what's the difference? Yes.
One of them is what you do because you're doing it as a wrap. That's the all-inclusive trust deed going around. One of them is you're doing it as a wrap as an all-inclusive trust deed. In the case that if it's not a wrap because the person has 100% of the equity, then you don't need to do all-inclusive. A regular trust deed is fine.
Yeah. I'm going to give you the short version that I like. Good memory trick. All-inclusive includes all other trust deeds. If there's no other trust deed to include, it wouldn't be an all-inclusive. It would just be a note and deed of trust. So, but the remedy is going to be the same.
I get those extra points though, right?
You do,
okay.
Yes. In fact, I was ready for you this time, and the receptionist has gold stars, so. No, thank you. Hopefully. So strong 4, we're going to do a little game, right? And everyone has to participate. And what's funny is there's always somebody in the very back that they're like, the guy in front of me is really big. I'll just do this. You'll never see me. Like, I will find you and call you and be like, what's your answer, right? So everyone's going to yell out an answer. And the reason I do that is because if you proudly like yell out the wrong answer, you will never forget the right answer. So trust me, this is worth it, right? I'm watching you. Okay, lease option. Ooh, okay, so let's go through the analysis. Who's on title? Who owns the property? So who's it strong for? Seller. Yeah, that is going to be strong for the seller. They have the option to purchase it, and if they use the all-in-one form where it's sandwiched with the lease, they have to perform and then they can sell it. That's why most of us end up buying properties that have lease options, because the buyer can't perform and then sell it. So months. Now, a good eviction attorney can usually do the whole process in about 6 weeks, even if they show up to the proceeding and say, but I don't want to move. So I say 2 months, because then you're kind of, over-delivering instead of over-promising. And then legal costs, the start of the process is usually $500, right? Total process, you shouldn't be more than $1,500, but we're going to put $500 as the minimum. So your clients should at least expect that minimum. And the down payment is typically less than 5%, is what we see. By the way, which one of these do you think fails the most? You guys are all psychic. I love that. Okay, let's go to the other end of the spectrum. So same game as before, with an all-inclusive trustee to note, or a trustee to note, who's on title? Buyer. Who owns the property? Buyer. Who's that powerful for? Buyer. The buyer. So the foreclosure process in the state of Utah takes 4 months. On top of that, you might have to do the eviction, but I always put in the real practical number that I tell people, because a lot of times sellers will listen to the story and they don't start their default remedies when they can, right? So on average, your seller's probably going to be making the payment 7 months for the buyer. And if that's a big house payment, that's a big pain in the butt. So other thing with all-inclusives, legal costs for a private party foreclosure are usually at least $2,500. But you get a lot more money down. Why? Because you need it to justify the risk. So if somebody writes an offer to you and says, hey, my buyer has 10 grand down, let's do an all-inclusive. Now you've got a great way to explain why that's not an intelligent offer, right? So contract for deed and other contract sales are in the middle. They're kind of one that is not strictly benefiting one or the other as far as power position. So let's go through the same analysis, right? I'm watching. Who's on title? Who owns the property? Oh, I heard a few sellers. I love that. That is so good. Okay, I want to be clear. Buyer owns the property legally. Seller is holding title, just like Dave's example of the car. If I get a loan from Wells Fargo to buy a car, Wells Fargo can't come drive my car. They can't sell it. They can't refinance it with another bank. I can. I own the car. Now, this is actually the oldest form of real property finance, is a contract where you buy it, you get to occupy it, you get to farm it, but you don't get title to the land until you pay off the financing contract. But let me be very clear. The buyer is the owner. They can sell it. They can refinance it, even though they're not on title. Yes?
Back like 08, 09, there was a lot of lease option, or 07, I'd say. And then I read that they started looking at lease option as you had to foreclose because you had interest in the property, there was conveyance of ownership. So are you running into that, or how are you guys handling that right now?
That's a great question. So it's not specifically that it's a lease option. This is 501. So if you're like going to go to sleep for 30 seconds, this might be your time. What it is, and I'll phrase it this way, the general legal concept is, if you're stupid, the courts will punish you. But if you're really stupid, they might protect you. Okay? I really don't know how else to say it. So it actually, the first case in Utah was a 1906 Utah Supreme Court case where the buyer had I think it was 50% equity in the property. And so they required something beyond just a simple eviction or forfeiture. So if you do a lease option or you do a contract for deed, where the buyer's going to have significant equity in the property, right? And I've done them where they put down over 50%. If you do a contract for deed, you want to have the option of doing a non-judicial foreclosure, which my form does, because the courts want something in addition to just a simple process that's not a foreclosure. So it's not that all lease options required a judicial foreclosure, just the ones where it would have offended the court's sense of justice, whatever the heck that means, in the event. But I can tell you what it means. Usually they're finding if it's 30% or below, not offensive. Closer you get to 40%, it becomes more offensive, right? So if you're doing a non-all-inclusive transaction where the buyer's going to have significant equity, maybe give me a call and we'll talk about some additional protections the seller might want to take. That is such a great question. Like for me, that's a fun question. Everyone else wake up now, right? Okay, now we're going to talk about the contract for deed. And before we jump off the title versus ownership, even in a normal transaction with a bank or with cash, ownership transfers at the point valid consideration is given for the deed. You record it because by statute, that puts the world on notice that that ownership transfer has taken place, right? So in your normal deals, once valid consideration is given and the deed's delivered, that's the point ownership transfers, which again, if you were asleep for that, that's okay, there's no test. But the contract for deed is the one you can modify to be strong for both, right? You can extend, it's a 30-day forfeiture process, but you could, if you were making an offer, like when I buy FHA loan homes, and therefore I'm using a contract for deed instead of an all-inclusive, I will have a 90-day forfeiture period. Then I'm almost as protected as if I'd done an all-inclusive if there's a default. Now, I've never defaulted, but you can do that. What you can't do is what one attorney did. He did a foreclosure in 2.5 weeks. Now, I told you it takes 4 months, right? He thus created a situation where nobody legally owned the property, but you had competing interests with a claim to a percentage of ownership. Now, I knew how to fix that. So instead of paying $500,000 for that property, guess how much I paid for it? $68,000, right? So you can mess it up more than just having a fire. You can mess it up because somebody doesn't know what they're doing as far as default remedies. But the contract for deed, as long as it's 30 days or longer, you can use that as a negotiation point to benefit both parties instead of just one. So it is exactly 30 days longer, 1 month more than if you just rented the property. But why do most people that were doing lease option systems switch to a contract for deed? Because with the lease option, they were getting less than 5% down. The contract for deed, they're usually getting 10 to 20% down. That's a lot better. I would drop the mic too. That was awesome. So everybody have this? Okay, now we'll go to the second most valuable slide. Somebody? Yes.
Yeah, perfect, thanks. Hey, just a quick question. So is that the only benefit to a buyer on a contract for deed?
No, we're about to go through some more.
Are we? Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Oh, we got more. So I'm just saying, they make footballs you can put a GoPro in. Maybe you could do that with the mic. The ceiling? Okay. No, I love it. Hey, the exercise is good, right?
Yeah, I just had a question on a previous comment as to why certain title companies won't do a contract for deed, or whether they're just unable to or unwilling to.
You have to have it drafted by an attorney, drafted or reviewed by an attorney.
So if that title company doesn't have in-house attorney, they won't touch it? I mean, this was based on her comment over there.
Yeah, if they don't have an attorney, and the other thing is you can't use it for your client because it's not a state-approved form. And we'll go into, in this next slide, we're going to go into like what Utah did and how they could fix it, but that's your answer. The contract for deed has to be drafted by an attorney, and most title companies don't have an in-house attorney to draft it. Good? Want to make sure? Okay.
I have a question. If it's owned in a trust, we just need the person who can, if the property's owned in the trust and the seller wants to do this, we just need the person who's legally responsible to sign for the trust to agree to do this, even if that's not the seller who necessarily lives there.
Diving into trust law. Okay. The person with signatory authority in the trust would be the trustee. But the person with decision-making power is generally the beneficiary. Now, most estate plans have those people as the same people, right? So that would be a simple thing. But if you have something where it's like a parent's trust that's still being operated, you may have children beneficiaries and maybe a corporate trustee, and it would typically, again, be the beneficiaries that would be deciding whether or not they would do it. The trustee would be the one signing the documents if they did do it. Good question. You guys are asking some cool questions. All right, so next one, this is also in your handout. And this goes to the question about, is it the only benefit? Now, it is more advantageous, Josh, for a buyer to do an all-inclusive. That is a more advantageous contract for the buyer. We just saw that, right? So let's go through why a buyer or seller may or may not like it. Now, this first one is for sellers or investors. If you or your client is selling the property, let's just do two examples. They sold the property 4 years ago. On one of your clients sold it on a contract for deed. One of your clients sold it on an all-inclusive. And now the buyers have defaulted on both. Is there significant equity in those properties? Yes, right? Who do you think wants that equity? The seller does, right? So let's go through the analysis. If the seller that sold on a contract for deed, jackpot. They get the equity. Successfully completing the forfeiture process eliminates the contract. They already have title. There's no longer an equitable interest the buyer has. Seller gets that equity. So if you hadn't come to the class and you didn't know that, that's potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in value for your client, right? Exactly. All-inclusive, the highest bidder gets the equity. So if somebody like me shows up and bids $1 more than you're owed as the seller, you get paid off, but I get the equity. And then if they do a uniform real estate contract, which is Utah's version. By the way, have you guys, I've noticed this a lot. Utah loves to take things that are not broken and fix them until they're broken. So if uniform real estate contract was, well, we'll get to that. That's going to be in the can you refinance. I'll pause that comment for a moment. Yes?
Okay, with the all-inclusive trust deed, when you were saying that there was an instance where the seller evicted or foreclosed on that buyer and nobody owned it for a period of time, is that what you're talking about with the highest bidder?
No, that was because the attorney did an invalid foreclosure in 2.5 weeks.
Okay.
Yes, and I'll do the air quotes this time, sorry. Okay, so next one, can you refinance? This is incredibly important for your buyers. You don't want to put your buyers in a contract that cannot be refinanced, okay? You want to make sure they can refinance. George went over some of the reasons. I'll recapitulate those. Number one, you can use the value of the property versus the sales price. Let's use that same example. Your client bought it 4 years ago. What would they rather use? The value of the property to get a loan with no mortgage insurance and great terms because they got a lot of equity, or the sales price? No. They want to use the value of the property, right? If you use the wrong one, it's not in the guidelines. So, can you refinance? Contract for deed? Yes, you can. All inclusive. Yes, absolutely. That's the easiest one to refinance. And what's interesting is all lenders can refinance a contract for deed. It's in the guidelines. Not all of them know how, right? It's like a doctor. All doctors can do surgery, but if they've never done it before, yes. How hard could open heart surgery be, right? This is unfortunate because this is the one I would prefer to use because it is a state-approved form, but it's not in the guidelines. So it dooms your buyer to not be able to refinance if you do a uniform real estate contract. And it's funny because I had a client that called me and said, hey, we're doing a contract for deed, but the seller wants to close at XYZ company. And they got there and guess what they prepared? The uniform real estate contract. Conceptually, it's the same. The tragedy is the underwriters don't care if it's conceptually the same. If it's in their guidelines, they're safe. And by the way, I have nothing against underwriters. Understand, if they guess and get it wrong, they're fired because their company has to buy back the loan or can't sell it, right? That's a bad thing. So I understand why underwriters are making the decisions they are. I wish Utah would change the name back. That would just be a better solution. All right, due on sale probability. This is another one you're going to get questions about. We always get questions about it. You're going to get questions from your clients. So let's go through the analysis. Contract for deed is a fairly low probability because title does not transfer. All-inclusive trust deed, out of the three, is the highest probability because title does transfer. And the lender doesn't have to go research it. They'll get the tax notice that will show who's currently on title. And then uniform real estate contract, thankfully, is also a low probability because, again, title does not transfer. I will go back to touch on, and I will hit you in just a second, but the gentleman in the black shirt, what was your name? Mark. Your comment. The uniform real estate contract, another thing that would need to be modified, it does not have an option that satisfies for the large buyer equity issue that we were discussing. And so it's flawed in that regard because there is case law after they made that name change that, and you'll hear some people badmouth it and say, oh, that's horrible because you have to do a judicial foreclosure every time. If they changed and added some clauses, you wouldn't have to. You could do a non-judicial. So the contract for deed I've drafted does allow for the non-judicial, but that would be another thing. And then, yes, you had a question.
You were talking about the servicer. Typically, that's how they make their money.
Yeah.
And so they're likely not going to want to stop that.
No. If it's a servicing company, I mean, all of these are going to be low. This is comparative, right? So compared to like a UREC or a contract for deed, that's going to be the highest out of the three. But if it's a servicing company, probability is extremely low that they're going to do anything. Not impossible, though. Somebody else had a question. Yes.
So when you're doing a lease option, and what's the term of your lease that you should be putting in on the contract? Because like if you're putting in too short of we hear about it. Oh, I have a lease. Now the lease is up, rents are higher, the value of the property's gone up. What are you doing to protect the client from the seller just saying, I'm not going to renew the lease?
Yeah, and the reality is because property values have continued to increase, the seller's not going to, and it's more the option than the lease, right? So as a buyer's agent, if you're doing a lease option, you want to have the longest term possible.
Right.
Sellers generally don't. That's the one where I see the most resistance on a long term. So that's just what can you negotiate? I mean, if the seller doesn't care, right, put 100 years. Yeah. That's great for the buyer.
I'm just asking, is there something you're putting in there? I mean, obviously I want to be aware of that from my client.
Right.
But whether side I'm on, but I mean.
For the sellers, if you're doing it so the sellers can immediately purchase another property, you want to make sure the revenue will continue for at least another 3 years. Yeah. So you'd put 4-year minimum term if that's a requirement and the seller can't qualify for both house payments.
In that lease option scenario, could you write on or before like 3 years to satisfy that requirement?
I would give you a potentially better clause.
Okay.
First year, this is your purchase price. Second year, this is your purchase price. Third year, this is your purchase price. It rewards the seller for going longer and motivates the buyer to get it done quickly, and still qualifies as a
it still
lease that would
works, yeah.
allow the seller to use 75%.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. And I'm not going to say I've seen everything, but generally, if there's a clause that can be used, I've probably drafted or seen that clause. Yes.
When it comes to all-inclusive trust deeds and the probability of a due on sale, I mean, I hear about these tips and tricks of put it into the family's name trust where you're the beneficiary, or the address name LLC. I mean, is that recommended or just smoke?
You know, and most of my investors are using series LLCs, where they'll actually put the previous owner's name as the series name on the LLC. I can honestly say that because I've never seen a contract for deed called due on sale, it doesn't matter in that instance thus far. And an all-inclusive, the only time I've ever seen one was when it was Utah Housing. In any change, they don't care if it is the name of the people, the name of the property, right? Any change, they'll send out their letter saying we're going to start foreclosure. I think going back to what's the probability right now, yes, and I also do those things. I'll use the series name as the party's name, but that's mostly for the city, not for the mortgage company.
Okay.
Yeah, and the trusts, you have to be careful of, because there was a lot of fraud with trusts in like 2010, 11, and 12, where there were undisclosed beneficiaries. And so if you buy from a land trust, you run the risk of somebody saying, actually, I had been assigned that ownership interest. Here's my documentation, and I'm suing you. So I love trusts, but land trusts really are primarily valuable in Illinois because they have statutes that give them asset protection qualities similar to an LLC. In Utah, they're just a trust. And because you don't know how many amendments to that trust might have taken place, a lot of title company underwriters don't like them, and a lot of investors love them, but a lot of fraud can be committed with them. So just be careful is all I'm saying. If the trust can be used to great effect, just be careful if you're buying from like a land trust, an investment, real estate trust. Okay. Now, last one, can you do FHA financing over it? And by can you, this is should you ever, right? So with a contract for deed, you will not get put on the limited participation list for doing a contract for deed over FHA financing. Their prohibition is FHA seller financing where title transfers is what they prohibit. All-inclusive, you cannot, right? If you've remembered nothing else from the class, please just understand that is not worth the risk for you as an agent. Unless this is your last day being an agent, and maybe you don't care then. Yeah. And then again, with the uniform real estate contract, same thing. You will not get put on the list for doing a UREC. Everyone got that? Okay. Now we get into the money time, the how agents have taken this. Did you have a question? Okay. Taken this and really gone and like killed it. And I've never seen a better seller financing market. Even post 08 wasn't this good. So most agents are going to start with buyers because it is incredibly easy to find seller finance buyers if you know where you're looking. And the thing that's still like surprising to me is how many buyers have real money to put down. Like a lot of it. Yes. You have one of those. Okay. This might be your chance. Okay. So these are ways I've seen people successfully get buyers into their buyer pool. Now at the last class, I had an agent that I knew had done this. And I asked her how many buyers she'd gotten. Now she gets buyers not only with her own listings, but she'll contact other agents and say, I would like to market this for you. You won't have to pay me a thing. I would like permission to market this and include seller financing as an option, because if somebody came and said, here's half now and I'll give you half in 2 months, most sellers would take that and they will get written permission to do that. I asked her how many buyers she'd gotten into her buyer pool from doing that. Any guesses? 2,000, over 2,000, right? There are a lot of buyers searching for this. And if you have a listing, that's a great way to get buyers into your buyer pool. Who's got a listing in here? Okay. Keep your hands up. Keep your hand up if you know the interest rate. Okay. About half of them went down. Who's got a 4% or lower? Well, on the listing. Yeah. Okay. Who has 3.25, 3.75 or lower? Okay. 3.5 or lower. 3.25 or lower. 3% or lower. Okay. All of you should be going to those people that had their hands up and getting written permission to market to your SOI. You do not say that they will get that property, right? You say 4-bedroom, 3-bath in West Jordan, current interest rate. What is the current rate? Yeah. Yeah. 7%. Oh, I thought you said you had less than.
No, I did. I had 0%. Are you talking about what my
The listing is I'm talking about.
0?
Yeah. Yeah. So if you yeah, if you have a 3%, but that's a great way to do it, right? And they're going to talk to people and say, hey, there's a chance if you talk to this agent that they could get you those rates. Now, here's why I know that's possible. Last year I bought one and my rate on that is 2.5%, right? And if I can do it, it means it's possible. Does it take some looking? Yes. But there are sellers that will give you a better than market rate. Most of the ones we close are less than you can get from a bank with perfect credit. So all of your buyers should be interested in seller financing. But if you figured out during the course of this discussion how you could market to your clients and get them off the sidelines with the possibility of maybe getting a better than market rate and getting possibly an assumption on the end at that super low seller's interest rate, like how would you not send that out to your SOI, right? If you find them, they're experts that can help you to close the deal, but please do your job and actually find those people. My favorite place for lenders to find them is lending partners. If you ask a lender that's still actually in business and not working at Walmart, if they have buyers that have come in that make money, that have a great down payment, but can't qualify for the current interest rates, you're going to find some deals, right? I have yet to talk to a lender that's actually still doing lending that doesn't have a file cabinet and they know exactly what interest rate needs to hit, 5% or 4.75%, whatever it is, and they can do the loan for this person. Why would you not take that person and do a deal now and then let the lender just follow up and refinance them later? Second one is short sales. We haven't seen those in a while, but those were great because instead of telling the seller when they're like, well, great, what's going to happen with my family? You're going to earn a commission. You're going to sell my house. I'm going to be homeless. When the answer was, take the money you're not paying the bank, save it up, and we'll go get you into a home you can afford, that's a pretty easy sale. And you got 2 transactions instead of just 1. KSL and Craigslist. I have an agent that on his marketing, he'll put it on KSL and Facebook Marketplace, and he still uses Craigslist, even though that's antiquated, because he did get a deal off of that. But he'll put, I specialize in non-bank financing contract for deed. And he says he does that because everyone calls him to ask what the heck a contract for deed is. Well, in this instance, a seller called him. And the seller had a very high-end property that hadn't sold for 9 weeks. And they'd been doing the drop the price game. And he explained that the seller was like, what's a contract for deed? And he explained it. And the seller said, I would love to sell my property that way. And then explained that he had it listed, or that, well, that she, it was a she, had it listed. And when the seller went to their agent and said, hey, I'd like to sell my property this way, The agent said, oh, seller financing, I don't do that. He can have the listing. Which I think is kind of dumb, right? At least be like, sure, we'll team up, split it in half. How long do you think it took the agent that understood seller financing after raising it back up to the original sales price to sell that house? Close. It was 8 days. The offer they accepted was $300,000 down. Backup offer was $150,000 down. The agent got both sides of that sale, which was a really nice commission. Now, you guys, anyone remember Paul Harvey besides me? Okay. What was the famous line he had? And now the rest of the story. Yes. Do you guys want to hear the rest of the story on that one? Okay, I couldn't have predicted this. After the buyer moves in, I think it was 3.5 months, buyer's wife kicked him out and moved in her boyfriend. Buyer stops making the payment in retribution. Seller takes the house back. Does seller still have the 300 grand? Yes. Is agent happy they get to sell the house again? Yes. Did they already have a buyer with 150 grand down? Yes. And then they in the meantime, they'd already taken the seller to go buy another property.
I heard that buyer was single, so.
Well, but the original buyer had a $2 million listing in Park City. Who do you think picked that up? Same agent, right? So there's value in knowledge when you can benefit your clients. So another one is other agents. There's a guy, he will not let me teach this in his brokerage, because anytime they have anything that might work with seller financing, they just give it to him. He doesn't do any marketing. Yeah, he gets half the commission. All he does is send it to me. Swine, how do you get half the I'm just kidding. I love the guy. Past clients. You'd be surprised how many past clients are stuck in golden handcuffs in their houses. What are the golden handcuffs? Interest rates. If they have a 3.5% rate and they move across town to the exact same house, they could double their interest rate payment, right? How could you bring those people, those sellers that are now going to be your buyers, off the sidelines? What about that example Dave gave that's sitting on your desk? Yeah. If you resell their house at a 7.5%, 8%, they take that, apply it to their new payment, and add a prepayment penalty on the seller financing. That's a really cool way. All of those sellers that are trapped in their houses are just waiting for you guys to explain how they can get out of those handcuffs. Other agents are powerless to do that. The agents that we're working with that know how to do it, do you think they have a problem getting listings? They don't, right? So go out and get those listings. Talk to your past clients. If you're working with investors, instead of getting hard money, every property I bought in the past 14 months, I've been able to convince the seller it was in their best interest to leave the loan in place. Now, who also was it in the interest of? Me, right?
But you had to still come up with the 10% or whatever, or the 20%. So it's not like you did it.
I don't know. You don't want to know the cheapest amount I've ever paid for a house.
Less than 68,000. Less than 68,000 down.
It was an owner's policy and 2 settlement fees and a recording fee. So, but right now, there's an agent that came to the class. When it did something about it, they're buying it for that plus $2,500, right? Yes. So most of mine are distressed properties. So she asked, do I find most of these through foreclosures? I've got investors though, that find most of theirs on the internet or through wholesalers. I'll give you guys some free, I happen to firmly believe the art of negotiation is letting somebody else have your way. I'll tell you how to let somebody else want to leave their loan in place, especially if they have a distressed property. If I go in and I pay off their loan that's currently in foreclosure, on their credit report, forever and always, it's going to show on that credit line, in foreclosure, paid in full. That's bad. If instead I take them to a perfect payment history, that's going to get them back much more quickly. And they'll be able to show they sold it on seller financing, somebody else is making the payment, and they'll be able to offset the amount that I'm paying that covers their mortgage against their mortgage. So it's actually better for them, but it sure as heck is better for me. Okay, large corporations. Do you guys want to hear a large corporations example? Okay, so I had a gentleman that came to the class. His sister had been complaining at their family dinner they got together. She worked at UDOT, the sister did, about the fact that UDOT was getting hit with damages claims when they were kicking people out for the Western Corridor work they were doing, and that people could not immediately go buy another house. And it makes sense, right? Imagine you're my jury, and I'm the attorney, and I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, think about the house you live in right now. Think about where you marked on the doorway the height of your children. Think about the swing set in the backyard, that you've got those memories of the kids playing. Is your house worth just what this government appraiser says it's worth? Or is it worth something more? In your minds, you've already answered that question, haven't you? And then I say, imagine if you're getting kicked out of your home where you have all those memories, and now you are a permanent renter. Now how much is your home worth? Right? That's why it was a problem for UDOT. So this agent went in, and it was kind of funny because they said, we're going to do the meeting from 9 to 10. Can you make sure you're available in case we have any questions? I said, sure. Call me if you have any questions. This is how the phone call went. 9 o'clock on the dot, I get a phone call, and I hear, okay, Jax, go ahead. Like, that's not really how it's supposed to work. But he picked up the contract. He got every single one of those deals where the people couldn't immediately qualify to go get another house. You know, the smallest check he had to work with was $74,000, right? Do you have companies like Google and Adobe that are moving people into Utah from states like California, New York, coastal states, where they probably haven't sold their house in San Francisco, but they've got a bunch of cash and they want to be a homeowner now, right? Do you have a way to tap into those companies or other companies that move people in and out? I have one guy that does a lot with the military because of that, right? So think about what are the advantages you can take advantage of in your SOI. There might be a flow of business. Business owners are a great one. And I love using this for people that are self-employed, because most self-employed people, do they have crappy accountants or really good accountants? No, they have really good accountants.
No, they're really good self-employed.
Yeah.
But everyone says, oh,
Yeah. Okay, that might be true. But it's really cool when somebody's got in fact, a lot of these that I do on the high end, it's not because they couldn't qualify for the loan. It's to pay their accountant to do everything the lender's going to want. They're going to be 25, 50 grand, right? Plus all the headaches, plus all the back and forth. I have a lot of buyers that are just like I just did one in Park City. The guy's like, I've got $350,000. I just will not deal with the bank. He was willing to pay the seller above market sales price, everything else, because he just didn't want to hassle with the bank. Could he have qualified? Yes, he probably could have written a check for the house. But a lot of high-end clients, and myself included, I don't like dealing with banks. I would rather just deal with the seller and get the loan that way. Listings. Use your listings to get buyers, okay? I'm going to show you the tale of two agents. And I love doing this because it kind of drives home the systemization of what we're talking about. It's why some agents work really hard for 6 months and then just keep closing these without doing additional marketing or stress. So both these agents have a listing. Okay, so there's their listing. Do a triangle today. One agent takes their listing and they understand the value of getting buyers with the listing, right? It doesn't even have to be your listing. If you can go and sit with somebody that's got a 3% interest rate on a listing and get written permission to market that, and you market the heck out of it, and you get 10 buyers out of it. Now, 3 of those buyers might be the ones Dave mentioned. They should still be living with mom, right? 3 of them, maybe they've only got 40 or 50 grand down. But you're going to find buyers that have the $80,000, $100,000, $150,000 down. There's a surprising amount of those people. And a lot of these people are going to be people They had a thriving business before COVID, and COVID killed them, and now they're thriving again. So they've got a bunch of money, but they can't qualify for a loan right now. Or they've got really good accountants, or maybe they just bought the business. They're making 10 grand a month, but can use none of that income to qualify for a loan. And then you take your buyers. Let's say this buyer doesn't buy that listing. This one does, right? By the way, what did that just do to your commission? Exactly. Anyone have a problem with that? I hope not. But more importantly, let's say this guy wants to live in Taylorsville. So you go and you get a list of every sub 4% interest rate in the area this person wants to live in, and you start contacting those people. And because you know how to let them, like maybe they only give a 6% rate or even a 5%, they're still making money on the bank's money that they can apply towards their next home. And so you get some of those. I was a little hesitant on saying that that would be easy, but I had an agent that went and got the list because they had a buyer. They were able to say, I have a buyer that would be very interested in purchasing your house. Can we talk, right? They sent out 10 pieces of marketing and 2 people responded. Now, if you've ever done marketing before, that's phenomenal, right? Usually it's, you send out 1,000 and if you get 5, you're happy. But there are sellers that are trapped in a very good interest rate loan that would like to sell their home. And if you can solve their pain and get them where they want to go and show them that pathway, right? Then you've picked up either another double-ended deal, or let's say that buyer gets you 3 listings. Now, what do you do with those listings? Same thing, you go and you get more buyers, right? Now, if you are with any sort of group, like my favorite is the Latin community. Anyone else in here speak Spanish? I know you guys do. Okay. I had someone come to the class. I'm not going to tell you the name because some of you might know this agent. But she still to this day is like, Jax, I don't know what I'm doing. And I'm like, you're closing 4 to 6 a month. I think you're okay. She went out and just talked to the Spanish markets and different people and told them that she could get people that didn't have a social and didn't have most of those people get paid in cash, but it's a lot of cash, that she could get them a home. And then she did it and went back and told all of them, hey, I did it. And now she has a constant flow from that community. That's pretty cool, right? The reason I think it's cool is I love that community. Like, I think it's tragic that institutions say they shouldn't be homeowners. But guess what? They're awesome homeowners, right? And they deserve to have houses. So just a thought. But the SAT agent, they just threw it out on the MLS. They did 1 deal, got half the commission, and they thought they were awesome. But this is the business model. And there's so much demand right now. If you can figure out how to start marketing it, and Josh, I know you've got amazing marketing, right? Hopefully this kickstarted how we're going to get into that. Then my second favorite thing is 7 referrals. Most people that you successfully do this for are going to have 7 referrals that would be available to you, the studies show. Now that's not a Utah specific study. I think in Utah it would be a higher number because everybody knows everyone's business in Utah, it seems. But get those referrals, ask for them, whether it's the seller or the buyer, right? Ask for those referrals. So we've talked about how to get buyers. Make sure you have a lender that can fix credit, because a lot of times the buyer's issue will be credit. Each one of these circles is like a segment of the system. And the reasons systems are good are the same reasons, like I haven't had a McDonald's hamburger in 20 years, but they sell a lot of hamburgers, don't they? Because it's the same hamburger. It's systematized, it's fast, it's convenient. This is a good system for agents. Use your buyers to get listings. You've got an incredibly valuable tool to do that now. Use your listings to get more buyers. If you understand that simple concept and can do it well, you'll be like the guy that went from filing bankruptcy to being a multimillionaire because he figured out how to do that. And then always start with the final close in mind. That means you need to know the experts that can walk you through it and help you so that you don't have to learn everything to feel comfortable because somebody else already did that homework for you. So oftentimes that's going to be the lending partner, the title company, and having a broker or a team that understands how to support you in that. So there are always three types of people that show up to the class. And I should say that leave the class. You have the first kind. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise hands. You know who you are. You don't get it, right? You're sitting there and you're like, man, all-inclusive what? Contract for who? But if you're like that agent I talked about and you go out and actually do it, or you're like the agent that just calls the people in their SOI, and now they're doing 5 deals, and one of them is a multi-million-dollar commercial deal, that's awesome, right? Doesn't matter if you know it, as long as you know the experts that know it. You'll be very successful. Then, and I can tell there's like a few of you, I could pick you out, but I won't make you embarrassed. Like it made sense to you. It clicked. It wasn't something where it just like totally didn't make any sense. And you actually took the time to do the mental exercises on what you were going to do. Please write that down. This is what I'm going to do. Put a date to it and tell somebody that will make fun of you if you don't. Like that's the key to success. But if you get it and do it, you'll be very successful. Like I love those calls. Those are great phone calls when you guys are telling me the success stories you're having. And then there are those that just don't do it. They're like, I still don't understand it well enough. It just sounds complicated. That's tragic, right? And 15 years ago when we started teaching this, and I said, learn the script, would you like fries with that? It was really funny. But between 2008 and 2010, half of the people in here would have disappeared because they didn't know how to do anything but normal transactions, right? Over 50% of agents disappeared. They were licensed in 2008, were no longer licensed in 2010. Do you guys know what the recent downturn, how many agents have not renewed their license? You know what that number is? It's a lot, right? To me, I consider that a failure because I feel like if all of the agents, even if they don't understand it, had just done something about it using the tool of seller financing that's not rate dependent, in fact, it's rate independent, I think they would have renewed their license. I think they would have been like the guy that had the best year of his career last year because it was such a good seller financing market and still is. So I'm going to put up, again, when you get the email with the addendum, you're free to use it, but please click the link and leave us feedback. I said that you would probably want this information. I would put it in your phones now because even if I'm not working on the deal, I would rather see you not mess it up and see it be successful. And all of these people are good resources. Yes. So good attorneys own nothing. But yes, I do control it. Yes.
Could you give us the phone number for Elite? I've used you as professional. I know they're still around, but Elite.
I think they left. Yeah. Let's put it up on the board. That's a great question. That guy, I don't know, he looks weird though. He looks better in black and white than real life, I can tell you that much. Okay. Any other questions?
Thank you.
You bet. Oh. You guys are awesome. Okay. Let me say thank you, because I promise the number of attorneys that actually get applause is not high. So thank you. I appreciate that. University of Utah. That's awesome. Yeah. You know how I tell people they'll know if
Just a
they're ready?
reminder, if you did not fill out the form that went around with your name, email, phone number, and real estate license number, and you need credit for the CE, please come and see us up front.
How you doing, man? Yeah. Dad, nice to meet you.
Thank you, Jax.
It was still floating around.
I can feel my brain reaching the edges of its capacity.
Good to see you. How you been? Good. So good to see you. Yes, you're welcome. Thank you.
I've been asking questions and taking a number of wholesalers out to
You bet. Thank you for coming.
lunch for the last couple of months and just picking
Yeah.
their brains.
Hey, you bet. Thanks for coming.
Picking their brains and getting all that taken care of. And so every time I learn a little bit more and then I digest it.
Yeah.
Is there a wealth building strategy for the sellers? Let me give you my example.
Mm-hmm.
I am sitting on 2.75%
Mm-hmm.
mortgage, and if my wife, we're going to be empty nesters next year, my youngest graduates from high school.
Mm-hmm.
If we want to move, what are the strategies there to get in the next place?
Yeah. So you'd probably want to, you'd sell on a hybrid lease option contract for deed so you can use the payment to qualify for the next property. And obviously you want to get the highest interest rate possible with the longest prepayment penalty possible on the house you're selling. And then you're going to go buy the new house. Let's say you're at 6.5%. With the money from the previous house, you're going to have an effective interest rate that's really good. But what's awesome is when rates drop and you refinance,